The headstone she knelt beside didn't exist in our database, but I watched her place fresh daisies there every Tuesday for 6 months. My name is Director Chen, and I've managed Restwood Memorial Gardens for 12 years. In that time, I've seen my share of devoted mourners, widows who visit daily, children who leave toys on small graves, veterans who salute fallen comrades with military precision. The routine of grief has its own rhythm, and I've learned to respect the sacred nature of these visits without intrusion. My office overlooks the main pathway through Section 4, where the older graves rest beneath towering oak trees that have witnessed decades of sorrow and remembrance. The elderly woman first appeared on a Tuesday in late March. I noticed her because she moved differently than most visitors, not with the heavy shuffle of deep grief, but with a purposeful stride that suggested familiarity. She carried herself upright, despite her obvious age, her silver hair pinned back in a neat bun, wearing a dark coat that had seen better years but was meticulously maintained. She walked directly to Plot 47B, knelt with some difficulty, and placed a small bouquet of white daisies against what appeared to be a headstone. I watched her lips move in what looked like conversation, though I was too far away to hear words. Her gestures were animated. Sometimes she would nod, other times she would shake her head, as if responding to questions. After about 20 minutes, she would stand, brush dirt from her knees, and walk back toward the main gate with that same determined pace. The ritual never varied. Tuesdays, 3 in the afternoon, white daisies, 20 minutes of conversation. By the 4th visit, my curiosity got the better of me. After she left, I walked over to Plot 47B to check our records against whatever memorial she was visiting. That's when the unease began to creep in. According to our burial database, Plot 47B had been empty for 3 years. The last interment in that section was Plot 47A, where Eleanor Matsuda rested after passing from complications related to pneumonia. But Plot 47B showed no record of purchase, no scheduled burial, no headstone installation. Standing in the exact spot where I'd watched the woman kneel, I found myself staring at an unremarkable patch of grass. No headstone, no marker, no indication that anyone had ever been laid to rest there. Yet the grass showed clear signs of regular visitation, worn patches where knees had pressed into the earth, small indentations where flowers had been placed. I ran my finger along the ground and found several brown stems from previous bouquets, confirming that someone had indeed been leaving flowers in this precise location. I returned to my office and pulled up our digital records, then cross-referenced them with the physical plot maps we kept in the filing cabinets. Every search returned the same result: Plot 47B, vacant. I even called our main office and spoke with Margaret, who'd been handling burial records since before I was hired. She confirmed what our system showed. No one was buried in Plot 47B, and no headstone had ever been ordered for that location. The following Tuesday, I positioned myself at the window with a pair of binoculars, determined to observe more closely. The woman arrived at exactly 3 o'clock, walking with that same purposeful stride. I watched her approach what appeared to be empty ground, and knelt in precisely the same spot as before. From this closer observation, I could see her lips moving more clearly, and her expression seemed responsive. She would tilt her head as if listening, sometimes smile slightly, other times look concerned. But the most disturbing detail became apparent through the binoculars. She was looking up, not down at the ground where she'd placed the flowers, but up, as if making eye contact with someone standing directly in front of her. Her gaze tracked from left to right occasionally, following what appeared to be movement. At one point, she reached out her hand as if to touch something, her fingers curling around what looked like empty air. I decided to approach her the following week. Tuesday came, and she arrived with her usual punctuality. I walked casually through Section 4, timing my route to intersect with her visit. As I got closer, I could hear her voice clearly for the first time. "I know you didn't mean it," she was saying, her voice soft but clear. But 23 years is long enough to carry that weight. Your mother forgives you. She wants you to rest now. I stopped walking, frozen by the intimacy of what I was witnessing. The woman continued speaking, sometimes pausing as if listening to responses I couldn't hear. The accident wasn't your fault, Thomas. The ice was too thick that winter. No one could have saved her. I cleared my throat gently to announce my presence. The woman looked up at me with kind eyes that held no surprise at being discovered. "Are you the director here?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Director Chen. I hope I'm not intruding, but I noticed you visit regularly. I wanted to make sure you were finding everything you needed." She smiled, the expression both sad and peaceful. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. Thomas and I have been having these conversations for years now. He's been waiting here since 1999, you know. Couldn't move on until he heard the words he needed to hear." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Ma'am, I need to tell you, our records show that plot 47B is vacant. There's no burial here, no headstone registered to this location." Her expression didn't change, but she reached into her coat and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a young man with gentle eyes and a hesitant smile. Thomas Brennan. He was my grandson. Died trying to save a little girl who'd fallen through the ice at Cooper's Pond. They never found his body, but his spirit came here anyway. I think he was looking for consecrated ground to finally rest. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "But don't worry, Director Chen. After today, you won't see me anymore. Thomas just told me he's ready to go now. We finally found the peace we've both been searching for." As she walked away, I remained standing in plot 47B, staring down at the fresh daisies she'd left behind. When I looked up to watch her retreat, she was already gone, not walking down the path, but simply absent, as if she'd never been there at all. The following Tuesday, I waited by my window. 3 o'clock came and went. Plot 47B remained empty, visited only by the wind that scattered the dried petals of white daisies across ground that our records insisted had never held the dead. The security footage showed a figure standing perfectly still beside the Hendricks casket at 3:17 a.m. But when I checked the room, it was locked from the inside with no other way out. I'm Rodriguez, and I've been working the night shift at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 8 years. There's something about the quiet hours between midnight and dawn that suits my temperament. No grieving families to console, no phone calls to answer, just the steady work of preparation and the company of the dead. I prefer it this way. The deceased don't demand conversation or explanations, and they never complain about my methods. Night shift means I can work at my own pace, listening to old jazz records while I perform the delicate art of restoration that helps families remember their loved ones as they were in life. The building itself is a converted Victorian mansion, purchased by the Hendricks family in 1973 and renovated to serve our community's needs. The original architecture remains largely intact: high ceilings with ornate molding, hardwood floors that creak in predictable places, and thick walls that muffle sound between rooms. I know every sound this old building makes: the settling of floor joists around 2 a.m., the whisper of the ventilation system, cycling on and off, the gentle hum of our refrigeration units maintaining their constant temperature. My workspace is in the basement preparation room, but I make regular rounds throughout the building to check the viewing rooms and ensure everything remains secure. We maintain 4 viewing rooms on the main floor: A, B, C, and D, each decorated in muted colors with comfortable seating and soft lighting designed to provide dignity and comfort during difficult times. Room C has always been my favorite. It receives morning light through tall windows and has better acoustics than the others, making it feel less confined. The Hendricks case was routine in most respects. Margaret Hendricks, 74 years old, passed peacefully in her sleep after a long battle with emphysema. Her family requested a traditional service with viewing hours before the burial. I'd completed the preparation work Tuesday evening, and she was laid out in room C, wearing the navy blue dress her daughter had selected, her gray hair styled the way she'd worn it for family photographs. Everything was exactly as it should be, hands positioned naturally, makeup applied with subtle care, the casket interior arranged with the personal items her family had provided. Thursday night started like any other. I arrived at 11 p.m., checked the day shift notes, and began my routine maintenance tasks. Around midnight, I started the preparation work on our newest arrival, while jazz played softly from my portable radio. Miles Davis helped me focus during the meticulous work of restoration, and the familiar melodies made the night hours pass more quickly. At 1:30 a.m., I took my first round through the building. All viewing rooms were secure, the front entrance was locked, and the alarm system showed no unusual activity. Mrs. Hendricks rested peacefully in room C, the soft lighting casting gentle shadows that gave her face a serene expression. I adjusted the temperature slightly and returned to the basement to continue my work. The second round at 2:45 revealed nothing unusual. I developed this routine years ago as both a security measure and a way to stretch my legs during long shifts. The building felt completely normal. The same familiar creaks, the same ambient sounds, the same sense of quiet dignity that pervades spaces dedicated to honoring the dead. But during my 3 a.m. round, I noticed something that made me pause outside room C. The light seemed different, not brighter or dimmer, but somehow softer, as if filtered through gauze. I checked my watch, 3:04 a.m. The viewing wasn't scheduled until the following afternoon, so no one should be in the building except me. Yet I could sense a presence in that room, the way you might feel someone watching you even before you turn around. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Room C appeared exactly as I'd left it during my previous check. Mrs. Hendricks remained in her casket, positioned precisely as I'd arranged her. The flowers were undisturbed, the guest book was closed on its stand, and the chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the casket. But the air felt different, warmer, and carrying the faint scent of vanilla and tobacco, an odd combination that reminded me of old libraries. I completed my inspection and locked the room again, but the feeling of unease remained. Back in the basement, I found myself distracted from my work, glancing toward the ceiling, as if I might hear footsteps from the floor above. At 3:30, I decided to check our security system. We'd installed digital cameras throughout the building 2 years earlier, after a series of break-ins at funeral homes in neighboring counties. The system recorded continuously and allowed me to review footage from any time period. I accessed the recordings for room C and scrolled back to 3 a.m., curious to see if the cameras had captured whatever I'd sensed during my round. The footage from 3:17 a.m. made my hands shake as I reached for the replay button. A figure stood beside Mrs. Hendricks's casket, not clearly visible, but definitely present. The shape appeared to be wearing dark clothing and stood completely motionless, facing the casket as if paying respects. The figure had no clear features, existing more as a disturbance in the light than as a solid form. But the presence was undeniable. I rewound the footage and watched again. At 3:16, the room was empty. At 3:17, the figure appeared beside the casket without any visible entry. At 3:18, the figure was gone again, leaving no trace of its presence. The timestamp showed I'd entered the room at 3:04, meaning this apparition had materialized while I was inside the building, just 13 minutes after I'd completed my inspection. My logical mind searched for explanations. Could the camera have malfunctioned, creating a shadow or reflection that resembled a human form? Was this some kind of digital artifact caused by the compression software? I examined the footage frame by frame, but the figure remained consistent across multiple frames, maintaining the same position and apparent solidity. I climbed the stairs and returned to room C, unlocking the door with hands that weren't entirely steady. Everything remained exactly as before, but now I noticed details I'd missed during my earlier inspection. The guest book, which I was certain had been closed, now lay open to the first page. A pen that had been positioned to the right of the book now rested to the left. Most disturbing of all, the casket seemed to be positioned slightly differently shifted, perhaps 2 inches closer to the windows. I checked the locks on all doors and windows in room C. Everything was secure from the inside, with no possible entry points that wouldn't trigger our alarm system. The windows were locked and hadn't been opened in months. The only door required a key, and I carried the only copy during night shifts. Back in the basement, I tried to focus on my work, but my attention kept drifting to the ceiling. Every small sound seemed amplified. The building settling, the HVAC system cycling, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. I found myself checking the security monitors every few minutes, scanning room C for any sign of movement. At 4:30 a.m., I reviewed the footage again. This time, I expanded my search to include all cameras in the building throughout the entire night. The recordings showed my regular rounds, my movements between floors, and long periods of empty hallways and rooms. But in room C, at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night for the past week, the same figure appeared beside whatever casket was positioned there. I pulled up recordings from previous nights and found the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Monday night, 3:17 a.m., figure appears beside the Kowalski casket. Tuesday night, 3:17 a.m. figure appears beside the Chang casket. Wednesday night, 3:17 a.m., empty room because no services were scheduled. But the figure appeared anyway, standing in the exact position where a casket would normally be placed. As dawn approached and my shift neared its end, I realized I was no longer alone in this building during the quiet hours. Someone or something was keeping vigil with the dead, appearing each night at 3:17 a.m. to pay respects in room C. The figure never disturbed anything, never caused harm, and seemed to exist only in that single moment captured by our cameras. When the day shift arrived, I debated whether to mention my discovery. Instead, I simply noted in the log that all security checks had been completed without incident. Some mysteries, I decided, were better left undisturbed, especially those that seemed to honor the dead with such faithful regularity. That refrigeration unit always malfunctioned, dropping to exactly 31 degrees, and the bodies stored there began showing expressions that looked almost like smiles. My name is Williams, and I've worked as a mortician at Valley View Memorial for 15 years. In that time, I've handled every aspect of post-mortem care, from initial preparation to final presentation for viewing services. The work requires technical precision, emotional detachment, and absolute respect for the deceased and their families. Our facility maintains 6 refrigeration units for temporary storage, each one calibrated to preserve remains at a consistent 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to prevent deterioration, but not so cold as to cause tissue damage that might complicate preparation work. Cold Room 7 had been problematic since the day it was installed. The unit was identical to the others, a 7-foot by 4-foot stainless steel chamber with digital temperature controls and backup power systems. But while rooms 1 through 6 maintained their temperature settings flawlessly, room 7 had its own agenda. The digital display would show 38 degrees, but the actual internal temperature dropped to exactly 31 degrees every single time. We'd called repair technicians monthly for the first year after installation. They would arrive with their diagnostic equipment, run comprehensive tests on the compressor, thermostat, and refrigeration lines, and invariably conclude that everything was functioning perfectly. According to their instruments, room 7 was maintaining the correct temperature. According to our handheld thermometers and the evidence of our own experience, it was 7 degrees too cold. After the 6th repair visit yielded no results, we learned to work around the quirk. Room 7 became our overflow storage, used only when the other units were occupied. The excessive cold didn't harm the remains in any medical sense. If anything, it provided additional preservation. But there was something unsettling about opening that chamber and feeling the Arctic air that rolled out, far colder than it should have been. The first time I noticed a facial change in someone stored in room 7 was with Ernest Kowalski, a retired postal worker who'd passed from a heart attack at age 67. His family requested a closed casket service, so I wasn't expecting to do extensive facial preparation. But when I moved him from room 7 to the preparation table, I noticed his expression had shifted from the neutral repose he displayed when we first received him. Ernest looked peaceful when he arrived from the hospital, the slightly open mouth and relaxed features typical of those who pass suddenly. But after 3 days in room 7, his mouth had closed naturally, and the corners seemed to turn upward in the faintest suggestion of contentment. It wasn't dramatic enough to be immediately noticeable, just a subtle softening that made him appear more at rest than when he'd arrived. I attributed the change to natural settling of facial muscles in the unusually cold environment. Bodies undergo various changes during storage, and facial relaxation isn't uncommon. What bothered me was how peaceful Ernest looked, not the artificial serenity we create through preparation techniques, but something that seemed to come from within. The pattern became apparent over the following months. Anyone stored in room 7 for more than 48 hours showed similar changes. Martha Chen went from displaying the drawn features of someone who'd battled cancer to wearing an expression of quiet relief. David Rodriguez, who died in a car accident with obvious trauma to his face, somehow looked more complete after his time in the overcooled unit. Even children showed these changes. Little Sarah Murphy, who drowned in a swimming pool, lost the bluish tinge around her lips and gained color that made her appear to be sleeping rather than dead. The changes were always subtle, always peaceful, and always inexplicable from a medical standpoint. Facial muscles don't naturally arrange themselves into expressions of contentment post-mortem. If anything, the excessive cold should have caused tissue stiffness that would make such changes impossible. Yet everyone who spent time in room 7 emerged looking more at peace than when they'd entered. I started documenting the phenomenon with before and after photographs, careful to maintain the dignity and privacy that our profession demands. The images confirmed what I was observing: systematic facial changes that couldn't be explained by normal post-mortem processes. I showed the photographs to Dr. Axo Martinez, our consulting pathologist, who examined them with the same clinical detachment he brought to his regular duties. Interesting, was his only comment after reviewing dozens of comparison shots. Have you considered that you might be unconsciously altering their positioning when you move them from storage to preparation? I hadn't been altering anything. My procedures remained consistent, regardless of which storage unit was involved. But Dr. Martinez's skepticism made me more careful about my documentation. I began taking photographs immediately upon placing remains in room 7, then again when removing them, ensuring no handling occurred between shots. The changes continued to manifest. Harold Brennan entered room 7 with the slack-jawed expression typical of stroke victims. 72 hours later, he appeared to be smiling slightly, as if he'd heard an amusing story. Patricia Walsh went from displaying the pinched features of respiratory distress to looking as though she was breathing comfortably in her sleep. What disturbed me most wasn't the physical changes; those could potentially be explained through medical processes I didn't fully understand. What disturbed me was how right the changes looked. These people didn't just appear more peaceful. They looked like they'd found something they'd been searching for. Their expressions suggested contentment, resolution, even joy. I began paying closer attention to the families during viewing services, for those who'd been stored in room 7. Without exception, they commented on how peaceful their loved ones looked. "He looks so happy," Martha Chen's daughter said, tears streaming down her face. "It's like he finally found relief from the pain." David Rodriguez's wife spent an extra hour at his casket, commenting repeatedly on how complete he looked, despite the trauma he'd sustained. The family's reactions confirmed that I wasn't imagining the changes. These people looked different after their time in room 7, better, somehow. More finished. As if the excessive cold was providing something beyond preservation, something that helped them transition from life to death with greater ease. I started volunteering to take the overnight shifts when we had someone in room 7, curious to observe the changes as they occurred. The facility was quieter after hours, with only essential lighting and the constant hum of refrigeration units maintaining their vigil over our temporary residents. Around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, I was reviewing paperwork when I heard something from the storage area. Not a mechanical sound like the compressors cycling on and off, but something softer, almost like whispering. I walked through the corridor between storage rooms, listening carefully to identify the source. The sound was coming from room 7. I pressed my ear against the stainless steel door and heard it clearly. Soft voices engaged in what sounded like conversation. Multiple voices, men and women, speaking too quietly for me to distinguish words, but clearly communicating with each other. The conversation had the rhythm of people catching up with old friends, punctuated by what might have been gentle laughter. I checked our current residents. Room 7 currently housed 3 people. An elderly man named Thompson, who'd died of pneumonia, a middle-aged woman named Parker, who'd succumbed to complications from diabetes, and a teenager named Collins, who'd been killed in a motorcycle accident. None of them had known each other in life, according to their family information. Yet the voices I was hearing suggested they were engaged in animated discussion. When I opened room 7 to investigate, the voices stopped immediately. The 3 bodies rested exactly as I'd positioned them, showing no signs of movement or disturbance. But the air inside the chamber was even colder than usual, and I could swear I detected the faint scent of something floral, like the essence of a garden in full bloom. I closed the door and listened again. Silence. But after a few minutes, the soft murmur of conversation resumed, barely audible through the insulated walls. I spent the rest of my shift listening to those voices, never quite able to make out specific words, but increasingly certain that the occupants of room 7 were not as alone as they appeared. The next morning, when I transferred all 3 to the preparation area, each one displayed the same peaceful transformation I'd come to expect. But now I understood that room 7 wasn't just preserving their bodies, it was providing them with something they needed during their transition. A chance to connect with others who were making the same journey from life to whatever comes after. I never reported the voices or tried to explain the temperature malfunction again. Some equipment problems, I realized, might not be problems at all, but rather mechanisms we don't yet understand for helping the dead find the peace they deserve. I received a handwritten note requesting burial in the old section of Greenwood Cemetery, signed by someone who had been dead for 2 weeks, and the handwriting matched perfectly with the signature on file. My name is Hayes, and I've served as funeral director at Greenwood Memorial Services for 22 years. In that time, I've handled thousands of arrangements, from simple cremations to elaborate multi-day celebrations of life. Every family has specific requests, and part of my job is ensuring those final wishes are honored with dignity and precision. I maintain detailed files on every service we provide, including copies of wills, burial instructions, and personal preferences that families want incorporated into their loved ones' final arrangements. The note appeared on my desk on a Thursday morning in late September. I'd arrived at my usual time of 7:30 a.m., unlocked my office, and found the folded piece of paper centered precisely on my desk calendar. The cream-colored stationery was expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence rather than everyday notes. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, written in blue ink with a fountain pen. "Dear Director Hayes," the note began, "I am writing to request burial in Section C of Greenwood Cemetery's historical area, plot number 147. Please ensure the headstone reads simply, Eleanor Matsuda, beloved wife and mother, 1928 through 2022. I have enclosed payment for all services. Thank you. for your attention to this matter. Sincerely, Eleanor Matsuda. I read the note twice, before the impossibility of the situation registered fully. Eleanor Matsuda had died exactly 2 weeks earlier. I'd handled her arrangements personally, working with her daughter Linda to coordinate a cremation service according to Eleanor's previously stated wishes. We'd held the memorial service the previous Tuesday, and Linda had taken her mother's ashes home in a ceramic urn Eleanor had selected years before her death. But here was a note, written in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, requesting burial instead of cremation, and specifying plot details we'd never discussed during our meetings. I opened Eleanor's file and compared the signature on the note with the signature on her pre-arrangement contract from 2 years earlier. The handwriting was identical, the same careful formation of letters, the same slight rightward slant, the same distinctive way she crossed her T's and dotted her I's. I checked with Linda immediately, calling her at home to ask if she'd somehow received additional instructions from her mother before Eleanor's death. Linda seemed confused by my questions. Mom was very specific about wanting cremation, Linda said. She told me multiple times that she didn't want to take up space in a cemetery plot. She wanted her ashes scattered in the garden behind our house, where she grew her roses. We talked about this extensively during her final weeks. Did your mother ever mention Section C of our cemetery? Plot 147 specifically? Never. Mom hadn't set foot in a cemetery in years. She said they made her sad, and she preferred to remember people as they were in life rather than visiting graves. I hung up the phone and studied the note again. The paper felt real between my fingers. Not a photocopy or digital reproduction, but original stationery. The ink had the slight irregularity that comes from a fountain pen, including small spots where the pen had hesitated at the beginning of words. This was definitely handwritten, not printed or traced. Section C was indeed the historical portion of Greenwood Cemetery, established in 1897 and containing some of our community's oldest graves. Plot 147 had been vacant for decades, available for purchase, but in a section that rarely drew interest due to its distance from the main road and the weathered condition of surrounding monuments. I walked through Section C that afternoon, locating Plot 147 among the tilted headstones and overgrown pathways. The plot was positioned beneath a massive oak tree whose branches created a natural canopy over several graves. It was peaceful in an old-fashioned way, with a kind of timeless dignity that modern cemetery sections sometimes lack. But why would Eleanor request burial in a location she'd never visited, especially when she'd been adamant about cremation? And how could she have written detailed instructions 2 weeks after her death? The enclosed payment mentioned in the note was nowhere to be found. I searched my desk, checked the floor around my chair, and looked through every file folder that might have contained cash or a check. Nothing. Yet the note specifically mentioned enclosed payment, written as if Eleanor expected me to find money along with her instructions. I decided to research the history of Plot 147, thinking perhaps Eleanor had some family connection to the area that might explain her posthumous request. Our record showed the plot had been purchased in 1949 by a family named Brennan, but they'd never used it for burial. The Brennans had moved to another state in the 1950s, and the plot had reverted to cemetery ownership for non-payment of maintenance fees. The mystery deepened when I discovered that Eleanor Matsuda had been born Eleanor Brennan in 1928. She'd married Robert Matsuda in 1951 and taken his name, but her maiden name connected her directly to the family that had originally purchased Plot 147. I called Linda again and asked about her mother's maiden name and family history. Mom was Eleanor Brennan before she married Dad, Linda confirmed. But she never talked much about her family. I think they had some kind of falling out when she married Dad. You know how it was back then. Mixed marriages weren't always accepted by families. Did she ever mention owning property in Greenwood Cemetery? Property? No, never. Why would she own cemetery property? That evening, I returned to my office to file Eleanor's paperwork and found another note on my desk. Same cream-colored stationery, same careful handwriting, same blue fountain pen ink. Dear Director Hayes, thank you for researching my family connection to Plot 147. My father purchased that burial site for our family before the disagreements that separated us. I never had the opportunity to reconcile with him before his death, but I would like to rest in the place he intended for his family. The payment can be found in the small metal box buried 18 inches north of the oak tree's base. Please forgive the unusual nature of this request. Gratefully, Eleanor Matsuda. I sat in my office chair, holding the note with hands that weren't entirely steady. Eleanor had somehow known I would investigate the plot's history, and had provided additional information before I'd even asked for it. She was communicating with me 2 weeks after her cremation, giving me instructions that demonstrated knowledge of events happening after her death. The next morning, I drove to Section C with a small shovel and located the oak tree beside Plot 147. 18 inches north of the trunk, I found disturbed soil that looked recently excavated. I dug carefully and found a small metal cash box containing exactly the amount needed for burial services, headstone installation, and perpetual care fees. The money was old bills from the 1940s and 50s, crisp but yellowed with age. A note inside the box, written in different handwriting, read, "For Eleanor, when she's ready to come home. Love, Dad." I arranged for Eleanor's burial exactly as her posthumous notes requested. Linda was initially resistant to the idea of exhuming her mother's cremated remains for burial, but when I explained the family connection and showed her the money from her grandfather's cash, she agreed that her mother had found a way to communicate her true final wishes. The burial service was small and quiet, attended only by Linda and a few neighbors who'd known Eleanor during her lifetime. As we lowered the urn into the ground at Plot 147, I noticed a figure standing beneath the oak tree, an elderly man in a suit from the 1940s, watching the service with obvious satisfaction. When I looked again, he was gone, but the sense of completion lingered in that peaceful corner of Section C. Eleanor had found her way home to the family plot her father had purchased for her decades earlier, guided by messages from beyond death to correct the arrangement she'd made while still constrained by old hurts and misunderstandings. I never received another note from Eleanor Matsuda, but sometimes, when I walk through Section C, I notice fresh flowers on Plot 147 white roses that match the variety Eleanor grew in her garden, left by visitors I never see, but who clearly remember her with love. Every morning for a month, I found fresh dirt on 3 graves, as if someone had been digging from the inside, and the motion sensors registered underground movement between 2 and 4 a.m. I'm Sullivan, and I've worked as groundskeeper at Hillside Cemetery for 11 years. My job involves maintaining the landscape, ensuring proper drainage, monitoring the condition of headstones and monuments, and keeping the grounds presentable for the families who visit their loved ones. It's physical work that I find satisfying. There's something honest about caring for this space, where the living come to remember the dead, and I take pride in maintaining the dignity that grieving families deserve. Hillside covers 43 acres of gently rolling terrain, divided into sections that reflect different eras of our community's history. The older sections near the entrance contain elaborate Victorian monuments, while the newer areas feature simpler headstones and memorial gardens. I know every inch of these grounds, from the drainage patterns that direct rainwater away from grave sites to the mature trees that provide shade during summer memorial services. The 3 graves that began showing disturbances were located in Section B, a mid-century area developed in the 1960s. Plot 67 held Marcus Webb, a World War II veteran who'd passed in 2019. Plot 68 contained Sarah Chen, a retired teacher who died in 2021. Plot 69 was the resting place of David Martinez, a construction worker who'd been killed in an industrial accident in 2022. None of these three people had known each other in life, according to their burial records. They'd been interred months apart, had different funeral directors, and their families came from different parts of town. Yet their graves began showing identical signs of disturbance on the same night in early October. The first morning, I noticed the problem. I assumed we'd had vandals. Fresh soil was scattered around all three graves, dark earth that looked like it had been recently excavated. But the pattern was wrong for typical vandalism. Instead of damage to headstones or evidence of digging down into the graves, the soil appeared to have been pushed up from below, as if something underground had been trying to reach the surface. I cleaned up the disturbed earth, tamped down the soil, and made a note to check the area more frequently. Vandalism wasn't uncommon in cemeteries, especially around Halloween season, but this felt different. The scattered soil was too uniform, too evenly distributed around each grave. It looked less like random destruction and more like the aftermath of systematic excavation. The next morning, all three graves showed the same disturbance. Fresh soil scattered in identical patterns, pushed up from below rather than dug down from above. I spent extra time examining the areas, looking for footprints or tire tracks that might indicate human activity. The ground around the graves showed no signs of surface disturbance. No shoe prints, no tool marks, no evidence that anyone had approached these plots during the night. After the fourth consecutive morning of finding scattered soil, I decided to review our security system recordings. We'd installed motion-activated cameras throughout the cemetery after a series of thefts involving bronze memorial plaques. The cameras provided good coverage of most areas, including Section B, where the troubled graves were located. The recordings from the previous night showed nothing unusual on the surface. No people, no vehicles, no movement of any kind in Section B between sunset and sunrise. But our security system also included underground motion sensors, installed to detect unauthorized digging or attempted grave robbing. These sensors had been triggered repeatedly between 2 and 4 a.m., registering movement 6 feet below ground level at plots 67, 68, and 69. Underground movement at burial depth should have been impossible. The graves were years old, well settled, with caskets positioned in sealed burial vaults designed to prevent any shifting or collapse. Yet the sensor data showed consistent motion patterns that suggested something was moving beneath the surface, not the random settling that might occur with old graves, but purposeful, coordinated activity. I consulted with our cemetery manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd overseen hillside operations for 15 years. She reviewed the sensor data with the same methodical attention she brought to all cemetery business, but her expression grew increasingly troubled as she examined the readings. "This doesn't make sense," she said, pointing to the digital printouts. "These sensors are designed to detect digging from above, someone trying to reach a burial vault from the surface. But these readings suggest movement originating from below, as if something is trying to dig upward." We agreed to install additional monitoring equipment focused specifically on the three problematic graves. That night, I volunteered to stay on site and observe Section B directly, positioning myself in the maintenance shed with a clear view of plots 67 through 69. The cemetery at night has its own atmosphere, not frightening, exactly, but deeply quiet, in a way that makes every small sound noticeable. I'd worked night shifts before during major landscaping projects, and I was comfortable with the darkness and solitude. But this felt different. The air around Section B seemed heavier, charged with an expectancy that made me check my watch every few minutes. At exactly 2 a.m., I heard the sound. Not the mechanical noise of digging equipment, but something organic, like dozens of people clawing at packed earth with their bare hands. The sound came from underground, muffled by 6 feet of soil, but clearly audible in the still night air. I approached the three graves with a powerful flashlight, listening to the rhythmic scratching that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. The sound was definitely coming from below ground level, and it was getting stronger. I could hear what sounded like multiple sets of hands working frantically at the earth above them. The motion sensors began registering activity at the same moment the sound started. According to the digital display, something was moving at burial depth across all three plots simultaneously. The readings showed coordinated activity. Whatever was down there wasn't acting randomly, but seemed to be working together toward a common goal. I positioned myself between the three graves and waited. The scratching continued for nearly 2 hours, sometimes growing so loud I could hear individual fingernails dragging against wood and metal. But nothing broke through the surface. Whatever was trying to dig upward was encountering the sealed burial vaults that protected each casket, unable to penetrate the concrete barriers designed to preserve the integrity of the graves. Around 4 a.m., the sounds stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. The motion sensors went quiet, registering no further underground activity. But when dawn came and I was able to examine the graves properly, I found the same scattered soil that had appeared every morning for the past month. This time, however, I noticed something I'd missed during my previous cleanups. The soil wasn't just random earth, it was specific dirt that didn't match the composition of the ground around the graves. This was clay-heavy soil with a reddish tint, the kind of earth found in the older sections of the cemetery, near the original 19th century burials. I followed my suspicions and walked to Section A, where the oldest graves were located. Sure enough, 3 plots in the historical area showed signs of recent excavation, but these were dug from above, with clear evidence of systematic digging that had reached significant depth before being abandoned. The disturbed graves in Section A belonged to people who died in 1897, 1898, and 1899. Their headstones were weathered but still readable. Thomas Webb, Mary Chen, and Joseph Martinez, surnames that matched the 3 people buried in Section B, whose graves were being disturbed from below. I researched the family connections and discovered that Marcus Webb was the great-great-grandson of Thomas Webb. Sarah Chen was the great-great-granddaughter of Mary Chen, and David Martinez was the great-great-grandson of Joseph Martinez. 3 families, connected across more than a century, with ancestors trying to reach their descendants through 6 feet of earth and concrete. The pattern continued for several more nights, scratching sounds from below in Section B, motion sensor readings indicating underground movement, and fresh soil appearing each morning. But gradually, the activity began to diminish. The sounds grew softer, the motion sensor readings became less frequent, and the scattered soil decreased in volume. On the final night of disturbances, I heard something different beneath the scratching sounds. Voices, muffled by earth and concrete but clearly human, speaking words I couldn't quite distinguish, but that sounded like farewells. The tone was peaceful, resigned, like people saying goodbye after a long visit. The next morning, I found small personal items scattered among the soil around the 3 graves in Section B, items that shouldn't have existed. A military button that matched Thomas Webb's Civil War regiment, a teaching pin similar to ones worn by educators in Mary Chen's era, and a small brass tool that looked like something a 19th century craftsman might have used. Mrs. Rodriguez arranged for the items to be cleaned and researched. They were authentic artifacts from the 1890s, somehow transported from the old graves in Section A to the newer plots in Section B. But more importantly, the disturbances stopped completely after their appearance. The underground motion sensors never registered activity at those 3 graves again. No more scattered soil appeared on the morning rounds. The scratching sounds that had filled the night air for weeks fell silent permanently. I believe the ancestors found what they were looking for, a way to connect with their descendants across the barrier of death and time. The items they left behind were tokens of recognition, proof that family bonds can survive even the separation of different burial sections and more than a century of time. Sometimes, when I'm working alone in Section B, I notice that the soil around plots 67, 68, and 69 looks particularly rich and fertile, as if it's been nourished by something more than rain and decomposed leaves. The grass grows greener there, and flowers planted by visiting families seem to bloom longer and more vibrantly than in other parts of the cemetery. The dead, I've learned, have their own ways of reaching out to those they love, even when concrete vaults and 6 feet of earth stand in their way. And sometimes, the living need to know that their ancestors are still watching over them, still trying to bridge the gap between the world of the dead and the world of the living. The soft crying from the back of my hearse only occurred during certain transports, always stopping the moment I pulled over to investigate, leaving only the faint scent of lilacs and unexplained dampness on the casket's silk lining. My name is Martinez, and I've worked as a transport driver for Sunset Memorial Services for 9 years. The job involves moving deceased individuals between hospitals, funeral homes, and cemeteries throughout the county. It's solitary work that suits my temperament. I prefer the quiet dignity of these final journeys to the chaos of traffic and delivery schedules I handled in my previous career. Each transport is a sacred responsibility, ensuring that someone's final passage is conducted with respect and care. The vehicle I drive is a specially modified hearse built on a Cadillac chassis, equipped with a hydraulic loading system and climate control to maintain proper conditions during transport. The passenger compartment is separated from the cargo area by a solid partition, but sound can still travel between the sections. I've grown accustomed to the mechanical sounds of the vehicle, the hum of the air conditioning, the whisper of tires on pavement, the subtle creaks that any automobile makes during normal operation. My routes vary depending on daily needs, but I frequently transport between Mercy General Hospital and our preparation facility on the outskirts of town. It's a 20-minute drive through residential neighborhoods and past the old municipal park where families often gather for weekend picnics. The route has become so familiar that I could navigate it with my eyes closed, which is why I immediately noticed when something changed about certain transports. The crying began in early November, during a routine pickup from Mercy General. The deceased was Helen Morrison, an 82-year-old woman who'd passed peacefully after a long struggle with heart disease. Her family had requested immediate transport for preparation, and I'd loaded her with the same professional care I brought to every assignment. But 5 minutes into the drive, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone weeping in the cargo area. The crying was soft but clearly audible, the kind of subdued sobs that come from deep grief, muffled as if the person was trying to contain their sorrow. I assumed there had been some mistake, that a family member had somehow climbed into the back of the hearse during loading. I pulled over at the earliest safe opportunity and opened the cargo door to investigate. Helen Morrison rested exactly as I'd positioned her, secure in her transport container with no signs of disturbance. The cargo area was empty except for the deceased, yet the sound had definitely originated from that space. I checked every corner of the compartment, even looking beneath the platform where supplies were stored. Nothing, but as I stood there in the afternoon silence, I detected the faint scent of lilacs, sweet and organic, like fresh flowers rather than artificial fragrance. I completed the transport without further incident, but the experience left me unsettled. During 9 years of similar work, I'd never heard anything from the cargo area except the normal sounds of a vehicle in motion. Dead people don't cry, and family members don't hide in hearses during transport. Yet the weeping had been undeniably real, clearly audible through the partition that separated the driving compartment from the cargo area. The second occurrence happened 3 days later, during transport of James Chen, a middle-aged accountant who died suddenly from a stroke. Again, the crying began about 5 minutes into the journey, the same soft, grief-stricken sobs I'd heard during Helen Morrison's transport. This time I didn't pull over immediately, but listened more carefully to the sound. The weeping had rhythm and variation that suggested genuine human emotion, It wasn't a mechanical sound or audio artifact from the vehicle's systems, but the complex pattern of someone experiencing profound loss. The sobs would intensify for a few moments, then subside to quiet sniffles before building again. It was the sound of fresh grief, raw and immediate. When I did stop to investigate, I found the same result: an empty cargo area, an undisturbed body, and the lingering scent of lilacs that shouldn't have existed in the sterile environment of the hearse. But this time, I noticed something additional: a slight dampness on the silk lining of the transport container, as if tears had fallen onto the fabric. I began keeping detailed notes about which transports involved crying and which proceeded normally. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious, but after several weeks of documentation, I realized the weeping only occurred with specific types of cases. Helen Morrison had lost her husband 2 years earlier and died alone in the hospital with no immediate family present. James Chen had been estranged from his children for over a decade, with no reconciliation before his death. The crying seemed to accompany people who died with unresolved relationships or unfinished emotional business. Margaret Walsh, whose transport included 20 minutes of soft sobbing, had been unable to repair her relationship with her sister before succumbing to cancer. David Rodriguez, whose journey was marked by the most intense weeping I'd ever heard, had died in a car accident while driving to his daughter's wedding, after years of father-child conflict. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the crying itself. It was the growing certainty that the sounds weren't coming from the deceased. The weeping had the quality of someone observing loss rather than experiencing it, as if invisible mourners were accompanying these particular transports to express the grief that hadn't been properly acknowledged during life. I started arriving early for pickups involving people who died with complicated family situations, positioning myself to observe the loading process more carefully. During Margaret Walsh's pickup, I watched the hospital staff secure her in the transport container with their usual professional efficiency. But as they closed the cargo door, I caught a glimpse of movement in the peripheral vision shadows that seemed to follow the container into the vehicle. The shadows weren't solid enough to photograph or point out to others, but they had the suggestion of human forms. They moved with the posture of people in mourning, heads bowed, shoulders slumped with the weight of sorrow. These figures seemed to climb into the hearse along with the deceased invisible passengers who brought their own grief to journeys that should have been solitary. During David Rodriguez's transport, the crying was so intense that I had to pull over 3 separate times, convinced that someone was hiding in the cargo area despite my previous experiences. Each time, I found the same evidence: undisturbed remains, empty space, the scent of lilacs, and dampness that suggested tears had been shed by visitors I couldn't see. But on the 3rd stop, I noticed something that changed my understanding of what was happening. The dampness on the transport container's lining had formed a pattern, not random moisture, but what appeared to be handprints pressed against the silk, as if someone had been touching the fabric in a gesture of farewell. I realized the weeping wasn't random supernatural activity, but a form of posthumous mourning. The people who died with unresolved relationships were being accompanied by the spirits of those who couldn't express their grief during life. Helen Morrison's husband, who'd passed 2 years earlier, was finally able to cry for the wife he'd left behind. James Chen's estranged children were mourning the father they'd never reconciled with. Margaret Walsh's sister was weeping for the relationship they'd never repaired. The invisible passengers weren't malevolent or threatening. They were simply expressing emotions that hadn't been allowed during life due to pride, anger, or circumstance. The hearse had become a mobile grieving space where the dead could finally receive the mourning they deserved from people who'd loved them despite their conflicts. I stopped pulling over to investigate the crying, instead allowing these journeys to proceed with the dignity that grief deserves. The weeping continued during appropriate transports, but I learned to recognize it as part of the healing process rather than something to fear. These invisible mourners needed the time and space to express their sorrow, and my hearse provided a sacred environment where reconciliation could finally occur. The scent of lilacs became a comfort rather than a mystery, the signature of love that had survived beyond death and separation. The dampness on transport containers represented tears that needed to be shed, grief that required expression before peace could be found. Sometimes, during particularly emotional transports, I would speak quietly to my invisible passengers, acknowledging their presence and their right to mourn. Take all the time you need, I would say to the empty cargo area. He knows you loved him, even when words were hard to find. The crying always stopped before we reached our destination, as if the invisible mourners understood that their time for grief had limits. But the transports felt different afterward, lighter somehow, as if burdens had been lifted and forgiveness had been exchanged between the living and the dead. I continue to drive for Sunset Memorial Services, carrying both the deceased and the invisible passengers who love them enough to weep. The hearse has become more than a vehicle for transport. It's a sanctuary where the complicated emotions of human relationships can finally find expression, where the dead receive the mourning they deserve, and where love proves stronger than the barriers that separate the living from those who have passed beyond. Some of the deceased seem to follow my movements in the preparation room mirrors, their closed eyes appearing to track my work, and the feeling of being watched never left, even after I covered all reflective surfaces. My name is Thompson, and I've worked as a mortuary makeup artist at Riverside Funeral Home for 7 years. My specialty is restoration cosmetics, using professional techniques to help families remember their loved ones as they appeared during life, rather than after illness or trauma. It's delicate work that requires artistic skill, emotional sensitivity, and absolute attention to detail. Each person I work with represents someone's final opportunity to see a loved one looking peaceful and whole. The preparation room at Riverside is designed for both functionality and dignity. Large mirrors mounted on adjustable arms allow me to view my work from multiple angles, ensuring that cosmetic application appears natural under various lighting conditions. The mirrors are essential tools. Without them, I might miss subtle asymmetries or color variations that could distract family members during viewing services. I've arranged the room carefully over the years, positioning mirrors to eliminate blind spots and provide comprehensive coverage of my workspace. My typical process involves several stages of preparation. First, I assess the condition of the deceased and plan the restoration approach based on family photographs and specific requests. Then I begin the careful work of color correction, feature enhancement, and final detailing that helps people look like themselves rather than like subjects of mortuary care. Throughout this process, I rely on mirror reflections to guide my hand and ensure professional results. The first time I noticed something unusual in the mirrors was during preparation of Eleanor Walsh, a 73-year-old woman who'd passed after a long battle with cancer. I was applying foundation to restore natural skin tone when I glanced up at the adjustable mirror to check my progress. In the reflection, Eleanor's closed eyes appeared to be following the movement of my brush across her cheek. I stopped working and looked directly at Eleanor's face. Her eyes were closed naturally, positioned exactly as they'd been since her arrival from the hospital. But when I returned my attention to the mirror, the reflection showed her eyes tracking my movements again, following the brush as I continued the cosmetic application. I attributed the phenomenon to fatigue or optical illusion. Mortuary work requires intense concentration, and after several hours of close detail work, the eyes can play tricks. Mirror reflections can create false impressions, especially when working under the bright lights necessary for precise color matching. I continued with Eleanor's preparation, but I found myself glancing at the mirrors more frequently, checking to see if the unsettling effect would repeat. It did. Throughout the remaining hour of Eleanor's preparation, her reflection consistently showed eyes that appeared to be observing my work. Not wide open, but partially visible beneath lids that seemed less closed in the mirror than in direct observation. The effect was subtle, but persistent. Every mirror in the room showed the same phenomenon, regardless of viewing angle. I completed Eleanor's preparation without mentioning the experience to anyone. The family was pleased with the results during their private viewing, commenting that she looked peaceful and natural. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor had been watching me work, somehow aware of the care I was taking to restore her appearance for her loved ones. The second occurrence was with Marcus Rodriguez, a 42-year-old construction worker who'd been killed in an industrial accident. His case required extensive restoration work due to facial trauma, and I approached the preparation with the extra attention that difficult cases demand. About 30 minutes into the process, I noticed the same phenomenon: eyes that appeared to track my movements in the mirror reflections while remaining closed during direct observation. This time, I experimented with the effect. I moved deliberately from one side of the table to the other, watching Marcus's reflection in the adjustable mirror. The eyes in the reflection followed my movement, maintaining what appeared to be eye contact as I changed position. When I worked on his left cheek, the reflected eyes looked toward my hands. When I moved to his right side, the eyes shifted to follow. But the most unsettling aspect was the expression in those reflected eyes. They didn't appear vacant or lifeless, but alert and appreciative, as if Marcus was conscious of my efforts on his behalf. The reflected face showed gratitude that wasn't visible when I looked directly at him, an awareness that suggested he understood the care I was taking to help his family remember him as he'd been in life. Over the following months, the phenomenon became routine with certain cases. Not everyone showed this reflected awareness. Some people remained completely still in both direct observation and mirror reflection. But approximately 1 in 4 showed the same eye-tracking behavior, always in the mirrors, but never in direct sight. I began to recognize patterns in which cases would display the reflected awareness. People who died unexpectedly often showed the most active eye movement, as if they were curious about the preparation process or grateful for the restoration work. Individuals who'd been disfigured by illness or accident seemed particularly engaged with the cosmetic application, their reflected eyes showing intense interest in the techniques I used to restore their natural appearance. The reflected awareness was always benevolent, never threatening or disturbing, just quietly observant. These people seemed to understand that I was working on their behalf, helping them look their best for final farewells with family and friends. The reflected eyes showed patience during difficult restoration work, and what appeared to be approval when particularly challenging repairs were completed successfully. But after several months of these experiences, I began feeling watched, even when no one was on the preparation table. I would arrive at work in the morning and sense observation from the mirrors before I'd even brought anyone in for preparation. During lunch breaks, I would catch glimpses of movement in peripheral vision reflections that suggested someone was present in the room when I was completely alone. The feeling grew stronger over time. Even when the preparation room was empty, the mirrors seemed to hold the lingering presence of everyone who'd shown reflected awareness during their preparation. It was as if part of their consciousness had remained behind, continuing to observe the space where they'd received their final care. I started covering the mirrors when I wasn't actively working, draping them with cloth to block the reflections that had become too intense for comfort. But the feeling of being watched persisted, even with covered mirrors. The presence of the deceased had become embedded in the room itself, independent of reflective surfaces. During Margaret Chen's preparation, a case involving significant restoration after a car accident, I removed the mirror covers to check my work and found something that made me step back from the table. Every mirror in the room showed not just Margaret's reflected awareness, but the accumulated presence of everyone who displayed the phenomenon over the previous months. The mirrors contained a gathering of the Grateful Dead, dozens of faces watching my work with expressions of appreciation and understanding. Eleanor Walsh was there, her eyes still tracking my movements. Marcus Rodriguez observed from another angle, his face showing the gratitude I'd first noticed months earlier. Everyone who'd ever shown reflected awareness during preparation had somehow remained present in the mirrors, creating an audience of the deceased who continued to witness the care provided to others. I realized the mirrors had become windows into a space where the recently dead could observe their final preparation, understanding the dignity and respect involved in mortuary care. They weren't trapped or suffering. They were simply grateful for the opportunity to see themselves being treated with professional compassion during their transition from life to final rest. I stopped covering the mirrors and learned to work comfortably under the observation of this benevolent audience. The reflected faces showed appreciation for careful work, patience during difficult restorations, and understanding when family requests required extra attention to detail. They had become silent partners in the process of helping families say goodbye with dignity. The preparation room at Riverside now feels like a collaborative space where the living and the dead work together toward the same goal, ensuring that final farewells are conducted with love, respect, and the recognition that every person deserves to be remembered at their best. The mirrors reflect not just my work, but the appreciation of those who benefit from the care and skill that mortuary arts provide. Sometimes, when I'm working on particularly challenging restorations, I can sense encouragement from the reflected faces that surround me. They understand the importance of what I do, and their presence has become a source of professional satisfaction rather than unease. The dead, it turns out, are the most grateful audience for the work that helps them maintain their dignity during life's final chapter. The same young man sat by the Morrison headstone every night at exactly 10 p.m., always gone by morning, and when I finally approached him, he looked up with Morrison's exact eyes and whispered, "Tell them I'm sorry," before fading like morning mist. My name is Davis, and I've worked as cemetery caretaker at Peaceful Meadows for 13 years. The job involves maintaining the grounds during daylight hours and conducting security rounds during evening and overnight shifts. I know every headstone, every tree, every pathway that winds through our 37 acres of memorial gardens. The work suits my solitary nature. There's something profound about caring for this place, where families come to remember their loved ones. And I take pride in ensuring the grounds remain dignified and peaceful. Peaceful Meadows operates on a traditional schedule, with visiting hours ending at sunset and the gates locked until dawn. But cemetery caretakers maintain access for security purposes, and I often walk the grounds during evening hours to check for damage, vandalism, or any disturbances that might affect the next day's visitors. These nighttime rounds have become routine over the years, a quiet time for reflection, while ensuring everything remains secure and respectful. The Morrison headstone is located in Section D, beneath a mature maple tree that provides shade during summer months. Robert Morrison was buried there in 2019 after dying in a motorcycle accident at age 24. His death had been sudden and traumatic, leaving behind parents who visited regularly and friends who often left flowers and personal mementos beside his grave marker. I first noticed the young man during my evening rounds in late September. He was sitting cross-legged beside the Morrison headstone, perfectly still in the gathering darkness. My initial assumption was that someone had remained in the cemetery after closing hours, not uncommon during the early stages of grief, when family members need extra time with their loved ones. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle someone who was clearly in mourning. But as I got closer, something about the visitor seemed unusual. He appeared to be about the same age as Robert Morrison would have been, with similar build and the same dark hair that showed in the photographs family members had shared during burial arrangement. But he was wearing clothes that seemed wrong somehow, not outdated exactly, but too formal for a casual evening visit. When I was about 20 feet away, the young man looked up at me, with eyes that were unmistakably familiar. They were Robert Morrison's eyes, the same unusual gray-green color, the same slightly asymmetrical shape, the same intense expression I remembered from family photographs. The resemblance was so complete that for a moment I wondered if Robert had somehow survived the accident that killed him. "Excuse me," I called out, "but the cemetery is closed for evening hours. I'm going to need to ask you to." The young man stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of unbearable sadness. "Tell them I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible in the evening air. "Tell them it wasn't supposed to happen like that." Before I could respond, he began to fade, not disappearing suddenly like a magician's trick, but gradually, becoming transparent like morning mist touched by sunlight. Within seconds, he was completely gone, leaving me standing alone beside Robert Morrison's headstone with only the sound of wind through maple leaves. I spent the next hour searching the entire cemetery, convinced that the visitor was hiding somewhere on the grounds. But the gates remained locked. There were no vehicles in the parking area, and I found no evidence that anyone had been present except for myself. Yet the encounter had been completely real. I'd seen the young man clearly, heard his voice distinctly, and felt the profound sadness that seemed to surround his presence. The next evening, I positioned myself near Section D well before 10 p.m., determined to observe more carefully if the visitor returned. At exactly 10 o'clock, he materialized beside the Morrison headstone, not walking into view from behind trees or monuments, but simply becoming visible as if he'd been there all along, but hadn't been solid enough to see. This time, I watched from a distance as the young man sat beside the grave and appeared to be speaking quietly to the headstone. His lips moved in what looked like conversation, sometimes pausing as if listening to responses. His posture suggested deep regret, shoulders slumped, head bowed, hands clasped in his lap like someone seeking forgiveness. I observed for nearly an hour, noting that the young man's presence seemed to affect the immediate environment. The air around the Morrison headstone appeared slightly warmer than the surrounding area, creating a faint heat shimmer that was barely visible in the darkness. Insects avoided the space entirely, and even the ever-present cemetery cats gave the area a wide berth during their nocturnal hunting expeditions. When I checked the next morning, I found fresh flowers beside Robert Morrison's headstone, white roses that hadn't been there the previous day. But no florist deliveries were scheduled, and the flowers showed no signs of having been professionally arranged. They appeared to have been picked from wild rose bushes, still carrying thorns and showing the irregular stems of flowers gathered by hand. I began documenting the nightly visits, keeping detailed notes about timing, behavior, and any physical evidence left behind. The pattern was completely consistent. The young man appeared at exactly 10 p.m., spent approximately 1 hour beside the Morrison headstone, and vanished before dawn. He always brought flowers, sometimes roses, occasionally daisies or violets, and always seemed to be engaged in one-sided conversation with someone he couldn't see. After 2 weeks of observations, I decided to research Robert Morrison's background more thoroughly. I contacted his parents, expressing general interest in their son's life and explaining that maintaining personal connections helped me care for the cemetery with greater understanding. They were grateful for my attention and shared details about Robert that made the nightly visits even more mysterious. Robert Morrison had been an only child, with no brothers or close male relatives who might explain the visitor's resemblance. He died alone in the motorcycle accident, with no passengers or witnesses to his final moments. The collision had been caused by mechanical failure rather than reckless driving, and he'd been pronounced dead at the scene before emergency responders could attempt life-saving measures. But the most significant detail emerged from conversations with Robert's girlfriend, Sarah, who visited the grave regularly during daylight hours. She mentioned that Robert had been planning to propose marriage on the night he was killed, carrying an engagement ring he'd saved months to purchase. The accident had occurred while he was riding to her apartment to ask her to marry him. He was so excited about the proposal, Sarah told me during one of her visits. He'd been planning the perfect moment for weeks, I think he was nervous about whether I'd say yes, even though we'd talked about marriage many times. He wanted everything to be perfect. The young man's nightly message, "Tell them I'm sorry," began to make sense in the context of Robert's unfinished business. He hadn't just died in an accident. He died while traveling to the most important moment of his life, leaving behind a proposal that would never be made and a question that would never be answered. I decided to approach the visitor again during his next appearance, this time prepared for the supernatural nature of the encounter. At 10 p.m., I waited beside the Morrison headstone as the young man materialized in his usual spot. "Robert?" I said quietly. He looked up with those familiar gray-green eyes, and I could see the pain that held him to this place night after night. "I was going to ask her to marry me," he whispered. "I had the ring. I had the words planned. I had everything perfect, but I never got the chance to tell her how much she meant to me." "Sarah knows you loved her," I replied. "She talks about you every time she visits. She knows you were coming to see her that night. But she doesn't know about the ring. She doesn't know I was ready to spend my life with her. She thinks maybe I was having doubts, that I was pulling away. I need her to know I was coming to ask her the most important question of my life." I promised Robert I would find a way to communicate his message to Sarah, to help her understand that his death had occurred during a journey toward greater commitment rather than away from it. The next morning, I called Sarah and asked if we could meet to discuss something important about Robert. When I explained the nightly visits and shared Robert's message, Sarah began crying not from fear or disbelief, but from relief that had been waiting years to arrive. "I found the ring," she said through her tears. "It was in his apartment after the accident, hidden in his sock drawer, but I didn't know what it meant. I thought maybe he'd bought it for someone else, or that he'd been planning to return it. I've carried that uncertainty all this time." That evening, Sarah joined me for the 10 p.m. visit. When Robert appeared beside his headstone, she was waiting with the engagement ring he'd never had the chance to offer. "Yes," she said simply, holding the ring where he could see it. "My answer is yes, and it always would have been yes." Robert's expression changed from anguish to profound peace. He smiled the first time I'd seen him show any emotion besides regret, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me to ask." He faded for the final time, but the fading was different than before. Instead of dissolving like mist, he seemed to step backward into light that wasn't visible until he entered it, walking towards something that had been waiting for him to complete his unfinished business. The nightly visits stopped after that evening. Robert Morrison had finally delivered his proposal and received the answer that would allow him to move forward into whatever comes after death. The Morrison headstone receives regular flowers from Sarah, who continues to visit during daylight hours, but the 10 p.m. vigil has ended. Sometimes, when I'm conducting evening rounds in Section D, I notice that the area around Robert's grave feels warmer and more peaceful than other parts of the cemetery. It's as if his final resolution left behind an atmosphere of completed love, a reminder that even death can't prevent important questions from being asked and answered when the timing is finally right. I kept receiving orders for custom caskets with measurements that didn't match any current clients, always arriving exactly 48 hours before someone with those exact dimensions passed away. And the orders came from a company that had been out of business for 15 years. My name is Lee, and I've worked as a coffin delivery specialist for Heritage Funeral Supply for 6 years. My job involves coordinating custom casket orders between funeral homes and manufacturers, ensuring that specific family requests are fulfilled with precision and delivered on schedule. It's detailed work that requires careful attention to measurements, materials, and timing. Families deserve exactly what they've ordered during their most difficult moments, and any errors can cause additional pain during an already traumatic experience. Heritage Funeral Supply serves funeral homes throughout a 3-county area, handling everything from standard burial caskets to elaborate custom designs that reflect the personality and interests of the deceased. I work closely with funeral directors to ensure orders are placed correctly, tracked through manufacturing, and delivered exactly when needed for services. The logistics can be complex, especially when dealing with rush orders or unusual specifications, but I take pride in the precision and reliability that grieving families deserve. The first unusual order arrived via fax on a Tuesday morning in October. The document appeared routine at first glance, a request for a custom hardwood casket with specific interior lining and hardware selections. But when I reviewed the details more carefully, several aspects didn't make sense. The measurements were unusually precise, not rounded to standard dimensions, but calculated to fractions of inches. The funeral home listed as the client was Riverside Memorial, which was legitimate, but they had no record of placing any such order. More puzzling was the company listed as the manufacturer, Eternal Rest Casket Company. I'd never heard of them despite 6 years in the industry, and a quick search of our vendor database returned no results. But the order included detailed contact information, manufacturing specifications that appeared professional, and a delivery timeline that seemed reasonable for custom work. I called Riverside Memorial to confirm the order details and speak with the funeral director who'd supposedly placed the request. Director Martinez was confused by my call. "We haven't placed any custom orders this week," he said. "All our current cases are using standard inventory caskets. Are you sure this order is for us?" I double-checked the paperwork and found that everything appeared legitimate, except for the client's memory of placing the order. The fax had come from a number I didn't recognize, and when I called it, the line was disconnected. But the order itself was detailed and professional, including payment authorization that checked out when I processed it through our standard billing system. I decided to treat it as a legitimate order with confused paperwork, not uncommon in the funeral industry, where emotional stress can lead to communication errors. I filed the request and assumed someone would contact me if there had been a mistake. 2 days later, Riverside Memorial called to place a rush order for a custom casket with exactly the measurements specified in the mysterious fax. An elderly man named Harold Brennan had passed unexpectedly, and his family requested a custom hardwood casket with the specific interior and hardware details that had appeared in the original order. The measurements matched perfectly, not approximately, but to the fraction of an inch. Director Martinez seemed puzzled when I mentioned that I'd already processed an order for these exact specifications. "That's impossible," he said. "Mr. Brennan died yesterday evening. His family just met with me this morning to discuss arrangements. How could you have an order for his casket before he passed away?" I couldn't explain the coincidence, but I was grateful that the advance order meant we could fulfill the family's wishes without delay. The casket was delivered on schedule, and the Brennan family was pleased with the quality and attention to detail. But the experience left me unsettled about the source of the original order and the precision with which it had anticipated specific needs. The second mysterious order arrived 3 weeks later, following the same pattern. A fax from Eternal Rest Casket Company requesting a custom casket with unusual measurements, listing a funeral home that had no record of placing the order, and including payment authorization that processed successfully. This time, the funeral home was Peaceful Rest, and the specifications called for a casket sized for a very small person, child-sized, but with adult-quality materials and craftsmanship. When I contacted Peaceful Rest to verify the order, Director Thompson had no knowledge of any custom requests. But 2 days later, he called to place a rush order for a child's casket with exactly the measurements specified in the advance fax. A 7-year-old girl named Emma Parker had been killed in a car accident, and her parents requested a custom casket with specific features that would help them remember her as she'd been in life. The pattern continued monthly throughout the fall and winter. Each mysterious order came from Eternal Rest Casket Company, specified precise measurements that didn't correspond to anyone currently in our client funeral home's care, and invariably matched the exact requirements for someone who would die within 48 hours of the order's arrival. I began keeping detailed records of these advance orders, trying to identify any common elements that might explain their origin. The measurements were always unique. No two orders specified the same dimensions, and each seemed tailored to a specific individual's physical characteristics. The funeral homes were scattered throughout our service area, with no apparent connection between them. The timing was eerily consistent. Orders arrived exactly 48 hours before they became necessary. My research into Eternal Rest Casket Company revealed troubling information. The company had indeed existed, operating from 1973 until 2007, when it closed due to the owner's death. Marcus Eternal, which may have been a chosen business name rather than his birth name, had run a small but respected casket manufacturing operation that specialized in custom work. The company had maintained an excellent reputation for quality and attention to detail, but it had been defunct for 15 years. Yet the fax orders continued to arrive from phone numbers that should have been disconnected, requesting caskets with specifications that perfectly matched the needs of people who hadn't yet died. The payment authorizations processed through financial institutions that should have had no record of Eternal Rest Casket Company's accounts. Everything about the orders should have been impossible, yet they consistently provided exactly what grieving families would request 2 days later. I decided to investigate the original Eternal Rest Casket Company facility, thinking perhaps someone had taken over the location and was using the old company name without proper legal transfer. The address led me to an industrial park on the outskirts of town, to a building that had been vacant for over a decade, according to the property management company. The building was empty, with broken windows and clear signs of years of abandonment. But when I walked around the perimeter, I found fresh tire tracks in the back parking area and evidence that someone had been using the loading dock recently. The bay doors were locked with new hardware that didn't match the building's deteriorated condition, and I could smell the distinctive odors of woodworking and finishing materials coming from inside. I returned to the building after dark and found lights visible through windows that had been boarded up from the outside. Somehow, activity was taking place inside a building that appeared completely vacant during daylight hours. I could hear the sounds of woodworking equipment, sanders, saws, and the pneumatic tools used in casket assembly. Through a gap in the boarding, I glimpsed an operation that looked exactly like a functioning casket manufacturing facility. Workers in period clothing from the 1970s moved between workbenches, crafting custom caskets with the same attention to detail that had made Eternal Rest Casket Company's reputation. The equipment appeared to be from the same era, and the techniques being used matched the traditional craftsmanship that modern manufacturers had largely abandoned. At the center of the operation, I saw a man who matched old photographs of Marcus Eternal, tall, thin, with the precise movements of an experienced craftsman. He was examining blueprints and calling out measurements to workers who responded with the efficiency of people who'd been working together for decades. The scene should have been impossible, but it explained the mysterious orders perfectly. Eternal Rest Casket Company was somehow continuing to operate 15 years after its official closure, taking orders from funeral homes that hadn't yet realized they needed custom caskets for people who hadn't yet died. I never confronted the impossible operation or tried to interfere with their work. The caskets they produced were consistently excellent, better than most modern manufacturers could provide, and they invariably arrived exactly when grieving families needed them most. The advance orders prevented delays that might have caused additional suffering during already difficult times. Instead, I learned to work with the mysterious system, processing the advance orders when they arrived and ensuring smooth delivery when funeral homes called to request exactly what Eternal Rest had already prepared. The impossible had become routine, and the impossible was providing better service than the possible ever had. The orders continued arriving with mechanical precision, always 48 hours in advance, always perfectly matched to someone's final needs, always crafted with the care and attention that Marcus Eternal had been known for during his company's official years of operation. I stopped questioning the source and focused on ensuring that families received the quality they deserved during their most vulnerable moments. Sometimes, when delivering caskets that had been ordered before anyone knew they would be needed, I would notice a sense of completion in the funeral homes, as if everything was falling into place exactly as it should. The family seemed more at peace with their arrangements, commenting on how perfectly the caskets matched their vision for honoring their loved ones. I realized that death might have its own logistics, operating according to schedules and systems that the living can't fully understand. Marcus Eternal had found a way to continue serving families even after his own death, ensuring that custom caskets were ready when grief struck and time became precious. The advance orders from Eternal Rest Casket Company have become a regular part of my work routine, a reminder that some services transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. I process each mysterious order with the same professional care I bring to conventional requests, knowing that somewhere in the space between the living and the dead, a craftsman continues to work with dedication that even death couldn't interrupt. All flowers placed in Section K withered within hours, but only the red ones, white and yellow blooms, thrived normally. And when I researched the area, I learned it was once a Civil War field hospital, where soldiers with fatal wounds were separated by red cloth markers. My name is Walsh, and I've served as ground supervisor at Riverside Memorial Park for 16 years. The job involves overseeing landscape maintenance, coordinating with families about memorial plantings, and ensuring that our 48 acres remain beautiful and dignified for the thousands of people who visit their loved ones throughout the year. Each section of the cemetery has its own character and maintenance requirements, from the elaborate Victorian monuments in the original sections to the modern memorial gardens with their standardized markers and planned landscaping. Section K occupies a gentle slope in the northeastern corner of our property, established in 1957 to accommodate the growing needs of our expanding community. The area contains approximately 200 burial plots arranged in orderly rows, with mature oak trees providing natural shade and a sense of permanence that families appreciate when selecting final resting places for their loved ones. The soil composition is typical for our region, well-draining clay with good mineral content that usually supports healthy plant growth throughout the seasons. I first noticed the flower problem during my routine morning inspections in early spring. Mrs. Patterson had visited her husband's grave in Section K the previous afternoon, leaving a beautiful arrangement of mixed flowers that included red roses, white lilies, and yellow daffodils. When I checked the grave the next morning as part of my regular maintenance rounds, I found something that made no botanical sense. The red roses were completely dead, not wilted or drooping, but desiccated, as if they'd been exposed to extreme heat for weeks. The petals were brittle and brown, crumbling at the slightest touch. Yet the white lilies and yellow daffodils, in the same arrangement, appeared fresh and healthy, showing no signs of distress despite sharing the same water source and exposure to identical environmental conditions. I assumed the roses had been damaged during transport, or were already failing when Mrs. Patterson placed them. Red roses can be sensitive to temperature changes and handling stress, while lilies and daffodils tend to be more resilient. I disposed of the dead roses and made a note to mention the issue if Mrs. Patterson asked about her arrangement during future visits. But the pattern repeated throughout the following weeks. Every red flower placed in Section K roses, carnations, geraniums, even artificial red flowers showed rapid deterioration that progressed far beyond normal aging. White and yellow flowers in the same arrangements remained healthy, often lasting well beyond their expected lifespan. Pink flowers seemed unaffected, and orange blooms showed no unusual problems. But anything in pure red consistently died within hours of placement. I began documenting the phenomenon with photographs and detailed notes about flower types, weather conditions, and placement locations within Section K. The pattern was absolutely consistent. Red flowers died rapidly and completely, while other colors thrived or aged normally. The effect occurred regardless of flower variety, freshness at time of placement, or care taken in arrangement. The soil in Section K tested normal for pH, mineral content, and moisture levels. I sent samples to the County Agricultural Extension Office, and their analysis revealed nothing unusual that might explain selective plant mortality based on flower color. The irrigation system functioned properly, delivering appropriate water levels throughout the section. There were no chemical spills, pest infestations, or environmental factors that could account for the specific targeting of red blooms. I consulted with local horticulturists and landscape specialists, thinking perhaps there was some botanical principle I didn't understand about red pigmentation and plant health. Their responses ranged from puzzled to skeptical. There was no known mechanism by which soil or environmental conditions could selectively target flowers based solely on color, while leaving genetically similar plants unharmed. Yet families continued to experience the same problem. The Rodriguez family placed red roses on their daughter's grave every Sunday, and every Monday I found the flowers reduced to brown, crumbling husks. The Chen family brought mixed arrangements that always included red carnations, and invariably only the red flowers would be dead the following day. After 2 months of consistent observations, I decided to research the history of Section K to see if there were any past events that might explain the unusual phenomenon. Cemetery records indicated that the area had been developed on land purchased from the Morrison family farm in 1956, but I wanted to understand what had occurred on the property before it became part of our memorial park. The County Historical Society provided archives that revealed disturbing information about the land's past. During the summer of 1863, the Morrison farm had served as an emergency field hospital following the Battle of Cedar Creek. Union forces had established a medical station in the farmhouse and surrounding fields to treat wounded soldiers who couldn't be transported to more distant hospitals. The field hospital had operated according to Civil War medical practices, which included a triage system for categorizing wounded soldiers based on the severity of their injuries. According to historical accounts, red cloth markers were used to identify soldiers with fatal wounds, men who were expected to die regardless of medical intervention, and who were moved to a separate area of the field to receive comfort care rather than active treatment. Section K of our cemetery had been built directly on the field, where dying soldiers marked with red cloth had spent their final hours. The ground had absorbed the blood and suffering of men who'd been segregated from their brothers in arms, left to die in a space designated for those beyond hope of recovery. The historical records included testimonies from medical personnel who'd worked at the field hospital. They described the red mark section as a place of profound sadness, where soldiers died far from home with only military chaplains and overworked medics to provide comfort. The men buried there had been interred in unmarked graves, with no identification or ceremony to honor their sacrifice. I realized that Section K was rejecting red flowers because the color carried too much association with the suffering that had occurred on that ground more than a century earlier. The earth itself seemed to remember the red cloth markers that had designated hopelessness and death, refusing to allow the color to flourish in a space where it had once symbolized the abandonment of dying men. I shared my research with our cemetery administrator, Director Martinez, who listened with the professional skepticism appropriate to cemetery management, but couldn't argue with the consistent evidence of the flower problem. We agreed to conduct a discrete experiment to test my theory about the historical connection. We arranged for the placement of flowers in various colors throughout Section K, documenting their condition over several days. The results confirmed the pattern. Red flowers died rapidly, while all other colors remained healthy. But we also discovered something I hadn't noticed during my routine observations. The areas where red flowers died most quickly corresponded exactly to locations where ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies consistent with unmarked graves. The Civil War soldiers buried without ceremony in the red-marked section were still present beneath the modern graves of Section K, and their influence was preventing red flowers from taking root in soil that remembered their suffering. The color that had marked them for death continued to be rejected by the earth, where they'd been forgotten. Director Martinez approved my request to install a small memorial marker, acknowledging the Civil War soldiers who died on the grounds that became Section K. We placed a simple bronze plaque near the oak trees, reading, "In memory of the Union soldiers who died at the Morrison Farm Field Hospital, 1863. Their sacrifice is not forgotten." The effect on red flowers was immediate and dramatic. Within days of installing the memorial, red blooms began surviving normally throughout Section K. The roses, carnations, and other red flowers that families placed on graves remained healthy and vibrant, aging naturally rather than withering within hours of placement. I believe the memorial provided the recognition that the Civil War soldiers had been denied for more than a century. By acknowledging their presence and honoring their sacrifice, we'd resolve the historical grievance that had been manifesting as rejection of the color associated with their abandonment. Section K now supports healthy flower growth in all colors, and families no longer lose their red floral arrangements to mysterious wilting. But I've developed a deeper appreciation for the layers of history that exist beneath the peaceful surface of cemetery grounds. The dead don't always rest quietly when their stories remain untold or their sacrifices go unacknowledged. Sometimes I walk through Section K in the early morning, before visitors arrive to tend their family graves. The oak trees seem more peaceful now, and the soil feels different beneath my feet, less burdened, somehow, as if an old weight has been lifted. The Civil War soldiers have found their recognition, and the earth has released its memory of red cloth markers and forgotten deaths. The memorial plaque receives regular visitors now, not just families of those buried in modern graves, but history enthusiasts and Civil War descendants who come to pay respects to soldiers whose names were lost, but whose presence endures in the ground they died defending. Red flowers placed near the memorial thrive beautifully, a vibrant reminder that recognition and remembrance can heal even the oldest wound. My flashlight beam would dim whenever I passed certain graves during midnight rounds, as if something was absorbing the light and the battery never died. But specific plots seemed to create shadows that moved independently. My name is Torres, and I've worked as security guard at Willowbrook Cemetery for 10 years. The position involves conducting regular patrols throughout our 56 acres during overnight hours, monitoring for vandalism, theft, or any disturbances that might affect the dignity and safety of the grounds. It's solitary work that requires comfort with darkness and silence, along with the ability to distinguish between normal nighttime sounds and activities that might require intervention or investigation. Willowbrook operates under a traditional schedule, with gates closing at sunset and no public access permitted until dawn. My shift begins at 11 p.m. and continues until 7 a.m., providing security coverage during the hours when the cemetery is most vulnerable to unauthorized activities. The work involves systematic patrols along established routes, checking perimeter fencing, monitoring buildings and monuments for damage, and maintaining a visible presence that deters potential vandals or trespassers. My equipment includes a powerful LED flashlight with rechargeable batteries, two-way radio communication with our central office, and a detailed map of the cemetery sections with notes about monuments, mausoleums, and areas that require special attention. The flashlight is essential for safe navigation along pathways and for conducting thorough inspections of areas where problems commonly occur. The light dimming began during my third year on the job, initially occurring so subtly that I attributed it to normal battery depletion. LED flashlights don't gradually dim like incandescent bulbs. They maintain consistent brightness until battery power drops below operational thresholds, then shut off completely. But during certain portions of my patrol route, the light output seemed to decrease noticeably without any corresponding change in battery status. The dimming was most pronounced in Section C, an older area of the cemetery, established in the 1920s and containing some of our most elaborate monuments and family mausoleums. The section includes several large crypts built by wealthy families, along with traditional headstones and memorial gardens that reflect the artistic styles popular during the early 20th century. When I walked through Section C, my flashlight beam would gradually weaken until it provided barely enough illumination to navigate safely along the pathways. But when I moved to adjacent sections, the light immediately returned to full brightness without any intervention from me. The battery indicator never showed depletion, and the flashlight functioned normally in all other areas of the cemetery. I initially suspected a defective flashlight or battery system, so I requested replacement equipment from our maintenance department. The new flashlight exhibited exactly the same behavior, full brightness throughout most of the cemetery, but significant dimming whenever I entered Section C. I tried different battery types and even switched to a backup flashlight during patrols, but the dimming effect persisted regardless of equipment used. The phenomenon wasn't limited to a general reduction in light output. Certain graves within Section C seemed to create zones of deeper darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate effectively. These weren't shadows cast by monuments or trees, but areas where light seemed to be absorbed or consumed by something invisible. The beam would enter these zones at full strength and emerge dimmed, as if it had passed through some kind of light-absorbing field. I began mapping the specific locations where light dimming occurred, noting the names on headstones and any identifying features that might explain the unusual effect. The affected graves didn't follow any obvious pattern. They included both elaborate monuments and simple headstones, represented families from different social and economic backgrounds, and contained burials from various decades spanning the section's history. What the affected graves did have in common was a sense of unresolved presence, as if the people buried there weren't entirely at rest. The dimming seemed to correlate with stories of incomplete lives, sudden deaths, or family tragedies that had left emotional business unfinished. These weren't necessarily violent or traumatic deaths, but passings that had occurred before important matters could be resolved or final words could be spoken. The Henderson family plot consistently created the most dramatic light absorption. According to cemetery records, the plot contained 3 generations of family members who died in a house fire in 1937. The entire family, grandparents, parents, and 2 children, had perished in a single night when an electrical fault caused flames that spread too quickly for escape. When I passed the Henderson plot during my rounds, my flashlight beam would dim to almost nothing, creating a zone of darkness so complete that I could barely see the headstones even when standing directly beside them. But strangest of all, the darkness around the Henderson graves seemed to move with purposeful intent, shifting and flowing like liquid shadow that responded to my presence. I observed the moving shadows more carefully during subsequent patrols, positioning myself at various angles around the affected graves to understand the nature of their movement. The shadows didn't behave like natural darkness. They appeared to have substance and intention, reaching toward my flashlight as if trying to draw away its illumination. During one particularly clear night in October, I decided to remain stationary beside the Henderson plot for an extended period, observing how the shadows responded to sustained presence. As I stood with my dimmed flashlight, the darkness around the graves began to take recognizable shapes, human forms, that seemed to be reaching upward, as if trying to emerge from the earth. The shadow figures weren't threatening or malevolent. They moved with desperate urgency, as if they were trying to communicate something important, but lacked the energy or ability to manifest in any way, except by absorbing light. The reaching gestures looked like people trying to attract attention, waving in the darkness to signal their continued presence. I began speaking quietly to the shadow figures during my rounds, acknowledging their presence and letting them know they were remembered. "I see you," I would say to the Henderson plot. "Your family is still talked about in town. People remember the tragedy and how much you were loved." The response was immediate and profound. The shadows would settle into calmer movements, less frantic reaching, and more peaceful swaying, as if my words provided some form of comfort or recognition they'd been seeking. The light absorption continued, but it felt less desperate and more like a gentle drawing of attention rather than a consumption of illumination. I researched the families buried in the graves that created the strongest dimming effects, learning their stories and understanding the circumstances that had left them in states of unrest. The Henderson family had been pillars of the community, active in church and local charities, with plans and commitments that were cut short by the unexpected house fire. Their sudden death had left numerous obligations unfulfilled and relationships without proper closure. Other affected graves had similar stories of interrupted lives, people who died with important work unfinished, relationships unreconciled, or messages undelivered. The light absorption seemed to be their way of creating presence in a world they could no longer directly influence, drawing energy from my flashlight to manifest the attention they needed to find peace. I started bringing additional information about the deceased during my rounds, sharing updates about their descendants, their community contributions that were still remembered, or historical recognition their families had received. The shadow figures would respond to these updates with calmer movements and less aggressive light absorption, as if the information helped them understand that their lives had meaning that extended beyond their physical deaths. The most dramatic change occurred when I learned that the Henderson house fire had led to new safety regulations that prevented similar tragedies throughout the county. Building codes had been updated, electrical inspection requirements had been strengthened, and fire department protocols had been revised based on lessons learned from the Henderson family's deaths. When I shared this information with the shadow figures at the Henderson plot, the light absorption stopped completely. My flashlight maintained full brightness throughout Section C for the first time in years, and the moving shadows settled into stillness that suggested peace rather than restlessness. I realized that the deceased had needed to know their deaths had served a purpose, that their tragedy had prevented others from experiencing similar losses. The light absorption had been their way of maintaining presence in the world until they could learn that their suffering hadn't been meaningless. My patrols through Section C now proceed with normal lighting, but I continue to speak with the families buried there, sharing news about their descendants and keeping them connected to the ongoing life of the community they'd served during their physical lives. The flashlight that once dimmed in their presence now illuminates their graves clearly, allowing me to tend their memorial spaces with the care and attention they deserve. The shadows that once moved with desperate urgency now rest peacefully in the natural darkness between my flashlight beam and the monuments that mark their resting places. They've found the recognition and closure they needed to move from restlessness to peace, transforming from light-absorbing presences into guardians who help me watch over the cemetery during the quiet hours of night. I found visitor log entries signed by people attending funerals scheduled for the following week, written in their own handwriting before they had even made arrangements, and the signatures appeared overnight in purple ink that no one in our office used. My name is Kent, and I've worked as office manager at Meadowbrook Funeral Home for 11 years. My responsibilities include maintaining visitor logs for memorial services, coordinating with families about arrangements, and ensuring that all administrative details are handled with the precision and sensitivity that grieving families deserve. The visitor logs serve both practical and emotional purposes. They help us track attendance for seating arrangements while providing families with permanent records of everyone who came to honor their loved ones. Our visitor log system uses bound books with individual pages for each service, positioned on stands near the entrance to our main chapel. Guests are encouraged to sign their names and include brief messages of condolence that families can read later when they're ready to appreciate the support they received during their time of loss. I replace the logs daily and file completed pages with other service documentation that families can request at any time. The unusual signatures began appearing during the second week of September, always written in distinctive purple ink that stood out against the standard black or blue pens we provided at signing stations. Purple ink isn't common for formal documents, and none of our office supplies included purple writing instruments. Yet several signatures in purple appeared overnight, written in the visitor logs for services that weren't scheduled until the following week. The first occurrence was in preparation for Margaret Walsh's memorial service, scheduled for the following Friday. When I arrived at work on Monday morning and reviewed the weekend's logs to file them properly, I found 3 signatures written in purple ink on the page designated for Margaret's service, a page that should have remained blank until the day of her funeral. The signatures read Eleanor Brennan, Thomas Morrison, and Sarah Chen, names that didn't correspond to anyone on our list of expected attendees for Margaret's service. But the handwriting was distinctive and careful, suggesting elderly individuals who took pride in their penmanship. Each signature was accompanied by a brief message of condolence, written in the same purple ink. Margaret was a dear friend and will be greatly missed, Eleanor Brennan had written. She helped me through my own difficult times with such kindness. A wonderful neighbor who always remembered birthdays and anniversaries, Thomas Morrison's entry read. The community won't be the same without her gentle spirit. Margaret's garden was the pride of Oak Street, Sarah Chen had noted. Her roses were legendary, and her generosity with vegetables helped so many families. I assumed someone had mistakenly signed the wrong log page, though I couldn't explain how they'd gained access to our office outside of business hours, or why they'd used purple ink. Our building is secured with electronic locks, and only authorized personnel have access codes. But the signatures were clearly genuine handwriting, rather than photocopies or digital reproductions. When I mentioned the signatures to Director Martinez, he suggested checking our client database to see if the names corresponded to anyone we'd served in recent months. The search results were unsettling. Eleanor Brennan, Thomas Morrison, and Sarah Chen had all been honored in memorial services at Meadowbrook during the previous year. They were deceased individuals whose funerals I'd personally coordinated, not living people who could have signed visitor logs. Yet their handwriting matched perfectly with the signatures in their own memorial service logs from months earlier. I compared the purple ink entries with the signatures these individuals had written on pre-arrangement contracts years before their deaths. The penmanship was identical. Same letter formations, same pressure patterns, same distinctive flourishes that make handwriting as unique as fingerprints. The phenomenon continued throughout the following weeks. Every Monday morning, I would find purple ink signatures in visitor logs for services scheduled later in the week, always from people who had died and been memorialized at Meadowbrook in previous months. The messages were consistently personal and specific, referencing relationships and memories that suggested genuine knowledge of the deceased person's life. I began researching the connections between the purple ink signers and the upcoming memorial services. In every case, there were authentic relationships between the deceased individuals writing the signatures and the people being honored in the upcoming services. Eleanor Brennan had indeed been Margaret Walsh's neighbor and friend. Thomas Morrison had lived on the same street and regularly exchanged garden produce with Margaret. Sarah Chen had been part of the same church community and had worked with Margaret on various charitable projects. The signatures weren't random supernatural activity. They were expressions of continued friendship and community connection that transcended death. The deceased were somehow maintaining awareness of their living friends' circumstances and finding ways to express condolences when those friends passed away. I started documenting the purple ink signatures more carefully, photographing each entry and researching the relationships they represented. The messages revealed detailed knowledge of ongoing community events and personal circumstances that suggested the deceased maintained awareness of the living world even after their own deaths. When Robert Martinez passed away and his memorial service was scheduled, The purple ink signatures that appeared overnight included a message from his brother Carlos, who had died in a construction accident 3 years earlier. Roberto, you always said you'd join me when the work was done. Welcome home, hermano. Mama is waiting for both of us. The personal details in these messages couldn't have been fabricated by anyone outside the families involved. They referenced private conversations, shared memories, and emotional connections that only the deceased individuals themselves would have known. The signatures were genuine communications from beyond death, providing comfort and continuity for families facing loss. I began leaving extra visitor log pages available overnight, ensuring there was space for the purple ink signatures that I knew would appear before each memorial service. The messages had become an important part of the grieving process for families, who found comfort in knowing their loved ones were being welcomed by friends and relatives who had died before them. The most remarkable signatures appeared before Helen Morrison's memorial service. Her late husband David had died 2 years earlier, and his purple ink message filled nearly half a page. My dearest Helen, 43 years of marriage wasn't enough, but it was perfect. Thank you for taking such good care of me during my illness, and for keeping our home beautiful even after I had to leave. The roses you planted beside my grave have been lovely this year. I've been waiting for you, and now we can tend the eternal garden together. Helen's family wept when they read David's message, finding in his words the closure and comfort that formal eulogies couldn't provide. The purple ink signatures had become a bridge between the living and the dead, allowing relationships to continue beyond the boundary of physical death. I never discovered the source of the purple ink, or how deceased individuals were able to write in our visitor logs, but I learned to expect and appreciate these overnight messages, which consistently provided families with evidence that death doesn't end love or friendship. The signatures became proof that consciousness and caring persist beyond physical life, and that the community of the dead continues to support the living during their most difficult transitions. The visitor logs at Meadowbrook now serve a dual purpose, recording the presence of living attendees while documenting the continued involvement of deceased friends and relatives who refuse to let death prevent them from expressing condolences and maintaining relationships. The purple ink signatures have become treasured keepsakes for families, permanent reminders that love and friendship are stronger than the separation between life and death. I discovered detailed preparation instructions written in my own handwriting for bodies that hadn't arrived yet, describing specific clothing requests and personal effects that families would later mention wanting included, and the notes appeared in my locked desk drawer every few weeks. My name is Jackson, and I've worked as embalmer at Pine Valley Memorial Services for 14 years. The position requires extensive training in mortuary science, chemistry, and the delicate art of preservation and restoration that helps families remember their loved ones with dignity. Each person I prepare represents someone's final opportunity to see a parent, spouse, child, or friend looking peaceful and whole, and I approach every case with the technical precision and emotional sensitivity that such sacred work demands. My preparation process begins with thorough assessment of each individual's condition, followed by consultation with family members about their specific wishes for clothing, cosmetics, personal effects, and presentation style. Some families want elaborate preparation, with formal attire and detailed cosmetic work, while others prefer simple, natural presentations that honor their loved one's personality and preferences during life. I maintain detailed preparation notes for every case, documenting the techniques used, materials applied, and specific requests from families about how their loved ones should be presented. These notes serve both professional and legal purposes, ensuring consistent quality while providing records that can be referenced if families have questions or concerns about the preparation process. My desk at Pine Valley includes a locked drawer where I keep confidential preparation files, chemical inventory records, and personal notes about challenging cases that require special attention or innovative techniques. The drawer uses a combination lock that only I know, and I've never shared access with other staff members due to the sensitive nature of embalming records. The first unusual preparation note appeared in early October, written on my standard preparation form in handwriting that was unmistakably my own. The note contained detailed instructions for preparing Dorothy Henderson, age 78, expected arrival Tuesday afternoon, cardiac arrest, family requests blue dress with pearl necklace, closed casket service, minimal cosmetic work. I read the note several times, unable to remember writing it or receiving any information about Dorothy Henderson. Our current cases were fully documented in my regular files, and none involved anyone named Dorothy Henderson. Yet the handwriting was definitely mine. I recognized the distinctive way I formed certain letters and the specific abbreviations I used for common preparation procedures. I checked with our office manager and funeral directors to ask about Dorothy Henderson, thinking perhaps I'd received information about an upcoming case and simply forgotten making the note. No one had any record of arrangements for anyone by that name, and our scheduling calendar showed no pending arrivals that matched the note's details. 2 days later, Pine Valley received a call from Mercy General Hospital about Dorothy Henderson, a 78-year-old woman who had died from cardiac arrest and whose family was requesting our services. When I met with her daughter to discuss preparation arrangements, she specified exactly what my mysterious note had already documented: blue dress, pearl necklace, closed casket service, and minimal cosmetic work, because Dorothy had always preferred a natural appearance. The preparation note had somehow anticipated Dorothy Henderson's death and her family's specific requests before anyone involved had made arrangements or even considered which funeral home to contact. The information was too detailed and accurate to be coincidental, yet I had no memory of writing the note or receiving the information it contained. The second occurrence happened 3 weeks later. I found another preparation note in my locked drawer, again written in my own handwriting. Marcus Rodriguez, age 45, industrial accident, extensive facial restoration required. Family will request closed casket, but wants viewing for immediate family only. Use extra tissue builder for cheek reconstruction. Blue suit in closet, at home. Once again, I had no memory of writing the note or learning about Marcus Rodriguez. Our current caseload didn't include anyone by that name, and the level of detail suggested direct communication with family members that hadn't occurred. Yet when Marcus Rodriguez's family contacted us 3 days later, following an industrial accident that had caused severe facial trauma, they specified exactly the arrangements my note had predicted. The pattern continued throughout the winter months. Every few weeks, I would find detailed preparation notes in my locked drawer, written in my own handwriting, but documenting cases that hadn't yet arrived. The notes always proved accurate when the predicted deaths occurred, and families made arrangements that matched exactly what the notes had specified. The notes included information that only family members would know: which clothes were meaningful to the deceased, what jewelry should be included, how hair should be styled, and whether cosmetic work should emphasize certain features to help the person look more like themselves during life. The level of personal detail suggested intimate knowledge of each individual's preferences and family dynamics. I began photographing the mysterious notes when they appeared, documenting the date of discovery, and comparing them with actual family requests when the cases eventually arrived. The correlation was perfect. Every detail specified in the advance notes matched exactly what families would later request during arrangement consultations. The handwriting analysis was the most unsettling aspect of the phenomenon. The notes weren't just similar to my handwriting, they were identical in every measurable way. Forensic analysis would have concluded that I'd written every note personally, yet I had no memory of writing them and no access to the information they contained before the deaths occurred. I began staying late at the office, hoping to catch myself in the act of writing the mysterious notes. But the notes never appeared when I was consciously present at my desk. They materialized only when the office was closed and I was away from the building, somehow written by my hand during times when I was provably somewhere else. The most disturbing note appeared in February. Eleanor Walsh, age 81. Stroke. Family will want to include handwritten letters from grandchildren in casket. Use rose-colored foundation to match complexion in family photograph. From 1985, pearl earrings. But no necklace due to religious preferences. Expect daughter to be very emotional during consultation. When Eleanor Walsh's family arrived following her death from stroke complications, her daughter was indeed highly emotional and could barely speak during our consultation. But she managed to specify exactly what my note had predicted. Rose-colored foundation to match a specific family photograph, pearl earrings without necklace for religious reasons, and inclusion of handwritten letters from grandchildren who lived out of state. I realized that the notes weren't being written by me in any conventional sense, but rather through me, by some force that possessed knowledge of upcoming deaths and family preferences that couldn't be obtained through normal means. My handwriting was being used as a tool to document information that existed before the deaths occurred, as if someone with access to future events was preparing me for cases I would soon need to handle. The notes began, including emotional guidance, along with technical preparation instructions. The note for Robert Martinez warned, family will be angry about delayed ambulance response, extra time needed during consultation to address their guilt and rage. Emphasize peaceful expression during preparation to help them focus on his life rather than circumstances of death. This psychological insight proved remarkably accurate when the Martinez family arrived, consumed with anger about emergency response delays. My awareness of their emotional state, provided by the mysterious note, allowed me to conduct the consultation with appropriate sensitivity and help them process their grief more constructively. I came to understand that the advanced preparation notes were a form of professional guidance from a source that understood both the technical and emotional aspects of mortuary care better than I did. The notes helped me provide better service to families by anticipating their needs and preparing me for the psychological challenges each case would present. The mysterious notes continue to appear in my locked drawer, and I've learned to trust their guidance implicitly. They've never been wrong about technical details or family preferences, and their psychological insights consistently help me provide more compassionate care during families' most difficult times. I believe the notes are written by some aspect of my own professional consciousness that exists outside normal time constraints. A part of me that can perceive future events and wants to ensure that every family receives the best possible care during their time of loss. The handwriting is mine because the knowledge comes from within me, even though my conscious mind can't access that information until the mysterious notes reveal it. The advanced preparation notes have become an invaluable tool that helps me serve families with greater skill and sensitivity than I could achieve through conscious preparation alone. They represent the best aspects of mortuary care technical excellence combined with emotional understanding that helps the dead rest peacefully and the living find comfort during their grief. I heard the church bells ringing at unusual hours in patterns that matched funeral processionals from decades earlier, and when I researched the sequences, each bell pattern corresponded exactly to funeral marches played for people buried in the adjacent cemetery. My name is Rivera, and I've served as chapel organist at St. Catherine's Church for 19 years. My position involves providing musical accompaniment for weekly services, special ceremonies, and the funeral masses that help our parish community honor deceased members with dignity and appropriate solemnity. The church organ is a magnificent instrument, installed in 1947, capable of producing everything from gentle hymns to powerful ceremonial music that fills our sanctuary with sound that seems to connect earth with heaven. St. Catherine's is connected historically and geographically to Resurrection Cemetery, which was established adjacent to our church grounds in 1892. The cemetery serves as the final resting place for thousands of parish members, and our church bells have traditionally tolled during funeral processions to announce the arrival of the deceased and guide mourners through the burial ceremony. The bell system includes 4 bronze bells of different sizes, capable of producing various tonal combinations appropriate for different types of services. My familiarity with funeral music spans decades of parish services, and I've developed an extensive repertoire of traditional hymns, classical pieces, and contemporary songs that help families celebrate their loved ones' lives while acknowledging the sorrow of separation. Each funeral presents unique musical requests, and I maintain detailed records of the pieces played for each service to help me avoid repetition and ensure appropriate variety in our musical offerings. The unusual bell ringing began in late autumn, occurring during hours when no services were scheduled and no one should have had access to the bell tower. I first noticed the phenomenon while practicing organ pieces for the following Sunday's service, working alone in the church during the quiet hours between afternoon and evening when the building was empty except for my presence at the organ bench. The bells began tolling in a complex pattern that I immediately recognized as a funeral processional, not a random sequence, but the specific 4-bell combination traditionally used to accompany the movement of caskets from hearse to altar during burial masses. The timing and rhythm were perfect, maintaining the solemn pace appropriate for mourners, following a coffin through the church entrance and down the center aisle. I stopped practicing and listened carefully to the bell sequence, counting the intervals and noting the specific combination of tones being produced. The pattern was immediately familiar, yet I couldn't place exactly when I'd heard it before. It wasn't the standard processional we used for contemporary services, but something older and more complex that suggested earlier musical traditions. When the bells stopped after approximately 5 minutes, I climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower to investigate. The tower was empty, with no signs that anyone had been operating the bell mechanisms manually. The electronic controls that we used for regular services were turned off, and the manual pull ropes hung undisturbed in their usual positions. The bell ringing occurred again 3 nights later, this time while I was preparing music for Margaret Chen's funeral service scheduled for the following day. The bells tolled for nearly 10 minutes in a different pattern than I'd heard previously, still recognizable as funeral music, but with variations in timing and tonal combinations that created a unique musical signature. I began recording the bell sequences when they occurred, using professional audio equipment to capture the exact timing and tonal patterns for later analysis. The recordings revealed musical complexity that exceeded what our current bell system could produce through normal operation, harmonic overtones, and resonance patterns that suggested the bells were being played by someone with exceptional skill and deep understanding of their acoustic properties. Each bell sequence was unique, following traditional funeral processional structures, but with personal variations that seemed to reflect individual musical preferences or cultural backgrounds. Some patterns incorporated elements of Irish funeral traditions, others reflected German or Polish influences, and a few included variations that suggested Hispanic or Italian musical heritage. I decided to research the historical records of funeral services at St. Catherine's, thinking the mysterious bell sequences might correspond to music from earlier decades when different organists and bell ringers had served the parish. Our church archives contained detailed service records dating back to the early 1900s, including notes about musical selections and special ceremonial arrangements for significant community members. The correlation I discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. Each recorded bell sequence matched exactly with funeral processionals played for specific individuals buried in Resurrection Cemetery during previous decades. The first pattern I'd heard corresponded to the funeral mass for Thomas Kowalski in 1963. The second sequence matched the service for Maria Santos in 1978. The bell patterns weren't random supernatural activity, they were precise recreations of funeral music played for people who had been honored at St. Catherine's years or decades earlier. Someone or something was using our church bells to replay the exact musical tributes that had accompanied these individuals to their final rest. I began cross-referencing the bell sequences with burial records from Resurrection Cemetery, confirming that each musical pattern corresponded to a specific person interred in the adjacent grounds. The dates of the original funeral services ranged from the 1940s through the 1980s, representing different eras of musical tradition and various organists who had served before my arrival. The most remarkable discovery was that the bell sequences occurred on significant anniversaries related to the deceased individuals they honored. Thomas Kowalski's funeral processional played on the 30th anniversary of his burial. Maria Santos's bells rang on what would have been her 95th birthday. The timing wasn't coincidental. The mysterious bell ringer was observing important dates in the lives and deaths of people buried in our cemetery. I began researching the individuals whose funeral music was being replayed, learning their stories and understanding their connections to St. Catherine's Parish community. Many had been prominent members who'd contributed significantly to church activities, longtime choir members, dedicated volunteers, generous donors who'd helped maintain the building and support charitable works. The bell sequences seemed to be expressions of continued presence, an ongoing connection to the church community these people had served during their lives. They weren't trapped or suffering, but rather maintaining their participation in parish life through music that celebrated their memory and honored their contributions. During the Christmas season, the bell patterns became more frequent and elaborate, sometimes including multiple sequences that seemed to represent groups of related individuals. On Christmas Eve, I recorded a complex series of bell patterns that corresponded to the funeral music for 3 generations of the Morrison family grandparents, parents, and children who had been active in St. Catherine's for over 50 years before their deaths in various decades. The Christmas Eve bell concert lasted nearly an hour, presenting a musical genealogy of the Morrison family's service to our parish. Each generation's funeral processional was distinct but harmonically related to the others, creating a family symphony that celebrated their collective contribution to church life. I realized that the mysterious bell sequences were a form of spiritual music ministry, continuing the service these individuals had provided during their physical lives. They were using the church bells to maintain their presence in the community that had shaped their faith and received their dedication. The phenomenon reached its most powerful expression during Holy Week, when the bells began ringing every evening in sequences that corresponded to all the individuals buried in Resurrection Cemetery who had died during Lent or Easter seasons throughout the parish's history. The week became a musical memorial service conducted by the deceased themselves, honoring their shared connection to the most sacred season of the Christian calendar. I started coordinating my organ practice sessions with the mysterious bell sequences, learning to accompany the supernatural performances with appropriate harmonies and supporting melodies. The combination created funeral music more beautiful and emotionally powerful than anything I could produce alone, as if the deceased organists and bell ringers from previous decades were collaborating with me across the boundary of death. The partnership transformed my understanding of church music and its role in connecting the living with those who have passed beyond physical life. The organ and bells became instruments of communication between different generations of faith, allowing the accumulated musical wisdom of deceased musicians to continue serving the parish community. Families who visit graves in Resurrection Cemetery during evening hours sometimes report hearing beautiful bell music that helps them feel closer to their departed loved ones. The mysterious sequences provide comfort and connection that recorded music or live performances couldn't match, because they represent the actual musical tributes played for specific individuals during their funeral services. I've learned to recognize the approaching anniversary dates that trigger the bell sequences, and I often remain in the church during evening hours to witness and accompany these supernatural musical performances. The collaboration between living and dead musicians has enriched my own playing and deepened my appreciation for the role of music in honoring life and providing comfort during grief. The bells of St. Catherine's continue to ring at unusual hours, played by invisible hands that remember every funeral processional ever performed within our walls. They serve as a bridge between the parish community of the living and the congregation of the faithful departed, using music to maintain connections that death cannot sever. The final bell sequences have become a testament to the power of music to transcend mortality and unite generations of believers in harmonies that echo from earth to heaven. In the mysterious overnight concerts played by our church bells, I hear evidence that love, faith, and service continue beyond physical death, expressed through melodies that celebrate lives well lived and connections that endure forever. Sometimes, when I'm playing the organ during regular services, I can sense the presence of former organists who've joined the celestial choir but still gather to support the music that serves their beloved parish community. The mysterious bell sequences have taught me that death is not an ending, but a graduation to a different form of service, where the music never stops, and the harmony includes voices from every generation that has ever lifted songs of praise within these sacred walls. I kept picking up whispered conversations on memorial service recordings that weren't audible during actual ceremonies, and the voices always discussed the crossing, while mentioning names of people who had died decades ago. My name is Foster, and I've worked as an audio technician for memoriam services for 8 years. My job involves setting up sound systems for memorial services, recording ceremonies for families who want permanent remembrances of their loved ones, and ensuring that eulogies, music, and readings are clearly audible throughout funeral chapels and ceremony spaces. It's technical work that serves an emotional purpose, helping families preserve the words and music that honor their deceased relatives and friends. The equipment I use ranges from simple recording devices for intimate services to complex multi-channel systems for large memorial gatherings. Each setup requires careful calibration to capture clear audio without being intrusive during sensitive moments. I test every system thoroughly before services begin, monitoring levels and adjusting settings to ensure optimal recording quality while remaining invisible to grieving families and their guests. St. Mary's Chapel is one of our most frequently used venues, a small traditional space with excellent acoustics and comfortable seating for up to 100 guests. The chapel's design includes natural wood surfaces that provide warmth without creating echo problems, and the vaulted ceiling offers enough height to prevent sound from feeling confined. I've recorded dozens of services in St. Mary's and know exactly how to position microphones for optimal coverage of the altar area and congregation seating. The first unusual recording occurred during Margaret Chen's memorial service in early November. It was a standard setup, wireless microphones for the pastor and family speakers, ambient recording to capture congregational responses, and a direct feed to create a master recording that could be edited for the family. The service proceeded normally, with touching eulogies and traditional hymns that honored Margaret's 78 years of life. But when I reviewed the recording that evening to prepare the family's edited version, I discovered audio that hadn't been present during the actual ceremony. Underneath the clearly recorded voices of speakers and congregation, I could hear whispered conversations that seemed to be taking place in the same acoustic space, but at much lower volume levels. The whispers weren't random background noise or electronic interference from the recording equipment. They had the rhythm and cadence of actual conversations between multiple people, speaking too quietly to distinguish individual words, but clearly communicating with each other. The conversation seemed to pause respectfully during eulogies and resume during musical portions of the service, as if the speakers were following proper memorial service etiquette. I assumed the whispers were somehow picking up conversations from adjacent rooms or nearby buildings through electromagnetic interference. St. Mary's is located in an older part of town with several historic buildings nearby, and radio frequency bleed-through can sometimes contaminate audio recordings. I made a note to use additional filtering during future services in that location. The second occurrence was during David Rodriguez's service 2 weeks later. Again, I found whispered conversations on the recording that hadn't been audible during the actual ceremony. This time, however, I was able to distinguish some of the words being spoken. The whispers included phrases like safe crossing, peaceful journey, and welcome home, language that suggested the speakers were discussing the transition from life to death. More intriguingly, I could make out names being mentioned in the whispered conversations. The speakers appeared to be discussing people called Thomas, Eleanor, and Sarah, names that didn't correspond to anyone present at David Rodriguez's service, but might have referred to other deceased individuals who'd preceded him in death. I began paying closer attention to the whispered conversations, using professional audio software to isolate and enhance the quiet voices that appeared on memorial service recordings. The conversations were definitely taking place in the same acoustic environment as the recorded services they had, the same reverb characteristics and ambient sound signatures as the chapel spaces where ceremonies occurred. The whispers appeared to be a form of supernatural commentary on the services, with multiple voices discussing each deceased person's readiness for the crossing and welcoming them into some kind of community of the dead. The conversations showed familiarity with people who died years or even decades earlier, suggesting that death might involve reunion with those who'd passed before. During Helen Morrison's service, the whispered voices became more distinct, and I was able to identify several separate speakers engaged in ongoing discussion about Helen's arrival. They seemed to know details about her life that hadn't been mentioned in the eulogy, references to her work as a teacher, her love of gardening, and her concern for her elderly neighbors. The voices spoke about her with warmth and recognition, as if they'd been waiting for her to join their group. "She helped so many children learn to read," one whisper said during a quiet moment between speakers. "The Peterson boy still remembers her patience with his stuttering." "And her roses," another voice added. "She'll want to know about the garden spaces we've prepared. Eleanor has been tending them since she arrived." The conversations included logistical discussions about the crossing, a process that seemed to involve guidance and support from those who'd already made the transition from life to death. The whispered voices appeared to be coordinating Helen's integration into whatever community exists beyond physical life, ensuring she would be welcomed and oriented to her new circumstances. I began researching the names mentioned in the whispered conversations, checking obituaries and burial records to see if they corresponded to real people who died in previous years. The correlation was remarkable. Every name mentioned in the supernatural conversations belonged to someone who'd passed away and been honored in memorial services I'd recorded over the past several years. Eleanor was Eleanor Walsh, whose service I'd recorded 8 months earlier. Thomas was Thomas Brennan, recorded the previous spring. Sarah was Sarah Parker, whose memorial I'd handled during the summer. The whispered voices were discussing people they'd apparently met through their own crossing experiences, creating a network of the deceased who helped newcomers adjust to death. The realization that I was somehow recording conversations between the dead was both fascinating and unsettling. The voices weren't threatening or malevolent. They sounded like concerned friends and relatives, discussing how to help someone through a difficult transition. But the implications were staggering. Death might not be an ending, but rather a relocation to a community where consciousness continues and relationships are maintained. I decided to test the phenomenon by deliberately setting up recording equipment in St. Mary's Chapel when no services were scheduled. If the whispered conversations were ongoing, rather than triggered by memorial ceremonies, I might be able to capture more extended discussions about the nature of death and whatever exists beyond physical life. The overnight recordings revealed continuous low-level conversations taking place in the empty chapel. The voices discussed recent arrivals, compared notes about the crossing process, and shared information about people who were approaching death in the living world. They seemed to be monitoring obituaries and preparing welcome committees for individuals who would soon need guidance through their own transitions. "Robert Martinez is in hospice," one voice reported during a 3 a.m. recording. "The doctors give him 2 weeks. maybe less. His wife Maria is handling it well, but she'll need extra support during the service. I remember Robert, another voice replied. Good man. Worked construction for 30 years. Thomas can help him. They'll have the building trades in common. The conversations revealed a sophisticated understanding of both the living and the dead, with established procedures for helping people cross from one state to the other. The deceased appeared to maintain awareness of events in the world they'd left behind, monitoring their living relatives and preparing assistance for those who would soon join them. Most remarkably, the whispered voices sometimes provided information that proved accurate days or weeks later. When they discussed Maria Martinez's need for support, I had no idea who they were talking about. But 2 weeks later, I was called to record a memorial service for Robert Martinez, whose wife Maria was indeed struggling with the loss and needed extra care from the funeral home staff. The supernatural recordings had become a preview of upcoming services, with the dead providing intelligence about their living relatives' needs and emotional states. I began using this information discreetly, suggesting additional support services for families who the whispered voices indicated would be particularly vulnerable during their grief. I never revealed the source of my insights to funeral directors or families, but I found ways to ensure that extra attention was available when the whispered voices suggested it would be needed. The dead, it seemed, were actively involved in caring for the living during the difficult process of losing loved ones. The memorial service recordings continue to capture conversations between the deceased, and I've learned to respect the privacy of their discussions while using their insights to provide better service to grieving families. Death, I now understand, is not a solitary experience, but a community event where those who've crossed before provide guidance, support, and welcome to those who are making the same transition. The whispered voices have become a reminder that the bonds between people survive physical death and that love continues to manifest as care and concern, even when it must be expressed from beyond the boundary between life and whatever comes after.